This is the DRS train.
Good morning, dear listeners, and welcome to 1995. I'm Peter Brook. I'm joined by Nedzo's F1 Grid Box, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast. Nedzo, so with the Austrian Grand Prix, I think you could compare it maybe to England v Slovakia, which happened yesterday as well, in that for most of it, nothing happened, and then suddenly right at the end, everything happened.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't watch the football yesterday. I just heard the stories of what happened. It was very chaotic, you could say, obviously, with possibly the focal point of the entire season coming right towards the end. Yeah, let's dive into this.
Yeah, it's been coming for a while because we've seen in the season at the beginning it seemed like we were effectively just picking up where we left off in 2023, but now McLaren have all the front row teams, they've all brought upgrades, they've all closed up, but particularly McLaren, who it seems have the faster car, but just the problem is that Red Bull have the faster driver. So with my 1995 reference, and this is something that Ciaron definitely agrees on as well, there are definitely comparisons to be made. So in 1995, we had a situation where Williams had built this, built a car that was reliable, it was well balanced, it was easy to drive, it worked really well. But the problem they had was that they kept squandering strategies, and Damon Hill kept crashing, usually into Schumacher. Whereas Benetton had a car that was not particularly easy to drive, but Michael just kind of ringed it around the track and made it work, whereas his teammates were just nowhere on it. And because of his sheer force of will and the mistakes from Williams, he was able to run away with the championship. And so we're seeing something similar this year now, because by all accounts, McLaren do seem to have the faster car. There are fewer handling problems with it than the Red Bull, because the Red Bull has always been a bit funny to drive, usually because it's tailored for Max. But this time, like, Checo is miles away. We'll get into that later. Max is definitely struggling more than he did last year, but it's through his own determination and his own, well, natural talent that he is still preventing McLaren from beating him. Even if today it was yesterday was a little bit more, a little bit more hands-on in that regard. But yeah, I think we should start. So this was a sprint weekend, but I think we'll go team by team. We kind of have to do Red Bull and McLaren. It's hard to talk about them separately, so I think we kind of need to interlace those two. So we'll start with Verstappen and Norris, who've become our title protagonists, if you will. So sprint race, they qualified front row, would you believe? And then in the race, well, the main highlight in the race was that three-way battle, because Oscar was involved as well, where Lando tried to get Max at turn 3, messed it up, and then dropped from first to third. And this is kind of how things seem to be playing out with them at the moment.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I mean, it's good that Lando is actually trying to battle with Max, because I think the only time we've actually seen people in recent years properly try and fight Max was Lewis in 2021. Leclerc didn't really battle him much on track, and now Lando is doing to Max what Max had done to every single driver in his entire career, which is send ludicrous dive bombs and somehow make them work, and they worked until they didn't for Lando. He seems to... While Max is very calculated in his very, very aggressive moves, Lando just seems to be trying to copy him and not kind of replicating the same form. Like that perfect example is turn 4 in the sprint, when he got into the lead, and then was it turn 4 or was it the corner before? And then Oscar just nipped through, and then for the rest of the sprint, Oscar stayed in front and they didn't switch positions again.
Yeah, no, it was turn 3, which is famous. So that's the big overtaking spot at the Red Bull ring. He ended up... I get now, because we saw a lot more action there in the actual race, is that he tried to take the lead, went wide, and then fell behind both Lando and Oscar going into Rauch, which is turn 4. So it's the main pointer people took from that, and this seems to have been a thing in the past few races, is Max's sort of stone cold like mentality of just not really buckling under pressure very much. because he just calmly took the position back. Lando said after the sprint that he left the door open like an amateur and then got passed by Oscar as well. This has been kind of the thing we've seen over the past few races is that the other drivers, when they have faster cars, they can't get it together because they keep making errors, even if they're very small errors. Because I mean, still, Spain, Lando could have won the race had he not messed up the start. Basically, that was enough to allow Max to come through and win it. Canada, everyone was making mistakes. I mean, Max went off once himself, but the rest of them were making way more errors, and that was enough for him to just come through. And that seems to be where Max is basically a cut above the rest at the moment.
Yes, I agree. He does kind of have the consistency that I think we've not seen from any Formula One driver since maybe Michael Schumacher in the early 2000s. And yeah, I mean, Lando isn't the best example for someone who's just behind him in terms of consistency, because he has also had his choke moments. You said Spain, where he didn't necessarily bottle it. He just didn't perform to 100% perfect, which is what you have to do if you want to go against Max in any sort of meaningful way. I mean, if he wants to try and challenge for this title, Lando needs to step his game up in terms of consistency, and he needs to get an upper hand on Max psychologically, and I don't think he's done that just yet.
Yeah, it's funny because you go into this thinking everyone's getting excited because the races are more entertaining now, but you kind of think, oh, we have a title battle, and then you remember that Max has an 80-point lead or 81 points. It's like, this really is not a title battle, because even in 2021, I don't think they went more than about 35, 40 points apart at any point, him and Lewis. So it really isn't. This again is the comparison with 95. Is that the pace is close, but the performance just isn't, and the gap is just getting bigger and bigger. But yeah, so the sprint, that move happened, and then Max just kind of checked out, and that. But in the race itself, because this is one of the issues I kind of have with sprints, is that it turned into effectively a practice session, because we saw some teams struggling in the sprint, mostly Ferrari. And then a few hours later, they did qualifying. Suddenly, they'd sorted that, and the pace was back. Red Bull seemed to have adjusted their setup and made it work better, because in the race, Max was just at the front, like 6, 7, 8 seconds ahead for most of it. And then for some reason, after his second stop, the tyres just go. He started. It was towards the end of his second stint. He started complaining a lot about the tyres. And Lando began closing up to him gradually. And then in a rare moment, we saw a mess up in the pits from Red Bull that was, a 6-second stop or something. And that was just enough to keep Lando in DRS range, which in a circuit like this, once someone is in DRS range, getting out of it again is very difficult, because there's like 3 DRS zones. And that was kind of what kicked off the action in the final stint.
Yeah, I tend to agree with most of what you said there. I think the Red Bull had that slow pit stop, and then Verstappen just had a slow outlap. I'm not sure exactly what. I think he did make a mistake at one point. I think that's what happened. I think he did make a lockup, and
there was a very big lockup at Rauch turn 4.
Yes, and I mean, there are a lot of comparisons that can be had with previous seasons. 1995, I think, is a decent example, although I think the gap between the Williams and the Benetton isn't as big as it is now with the McLaren and Red Bull. I think 1995, for me personally, really indicates how Damon Hill wasn't anywhere near really a championship level driver. He just managed to get into a good situation with an Adrian Newey car and dance off into the distance with a rookie teammate winning his only title. But aside from that, it's just weird. I mean, the whole weekend format is kind of geared towards. I mean, even the sprints. Like, we always talk about how sprints can provide more entertainment because there's one practice session before the weekend. But the new Parc Fermé rules that are coming for this year, which mean that now teams can make adjustments and make alterations after the sprints happened, kind of takes away that kind of the anomalous results that you can get because people haven't got their setups right. It's kind of helped the teams consolidate their positions, and that's a bit crap, I can't lie.
It's I mean, I think it makes sense within the context of having sprint weekends, which I don't think we should have at all, to allow them to change setup, because when they first introduced the sprints, the format was nuts. because we had, what was it? We had FP1, and then we did qualifying, and then we did FP3. But you weren't. But Parc Fermé was in force because qualifying had already happened, and then you did the sprint. And I was like, and I looked at this thinking that they have not thought this through. And this, of course, was back when the results of the sprint dictated the grid, and so it was no wonder that nobody dared try any moves in the sprint in case they messed it up, which of course Checo did in the very first sprint race. But this time, I think it seems fairer to give them that chance to change, I guess. But the whole format is stupid because it's like I like the idea of having only one practice session, but it's like they don't need so much setup time. We need more uncertainty. They don't need to be given 4 hours to set the car up perfectly and work out exactly what the tyres are going to do and all of that. But for the sprint, if you're not in the top 10, you're not fighting for points, so you may as well just use it as a chance to do a long run and see what the first stint is, trying to anticipate how the first stint would be in the actual race. So I think they need to go. But generally, the sprints, the new format has helped to improve them because we are seeing some reasonable racing. I mean, we've had the sprint in China was wet, so that one wasn't it. I think wet to dry, something like that, or maybe qualifying was wet. Miami was an all right sprint, but like last year, Austria's sprint last year was excellent. But there was no DRS, but it was changing conditions. It was kind of on the cusp between wet and dry, and that was enough to make the difference. I think also because this is naturally just a good circuit. And speaking of the circuit, the big change that they made this year was the removal or the addition of gravel on the exit of some of the corners, which was sorely needed because last year we had over 1,200 track limits violations in the race, and I think this year we only had about 3 or 4. And that, yeah, they really that. It helps. It feels like nature is healing now that we're sort of bringing gravel back in place of runoff.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with your points on the practice sessions. I mean, it is ironic that in Formula 2 and Formula 3, the series that's supposed to bring up these young talents and nurture young talent and develop them by giving them track time has, what is it, considering you have 3 hours of practice sessions in F1, you have about 1/6 of the time to practice in F3 and F2 than you do in the top level in the top category. To me, that's a bit stupid. I think we should put one 30-minute practice session in for Formula 1, just like you have in F2 and F3 to make it the same. And it would mean that you've got more fluctuation with the sprints, qualifying and the race. I mean, I don't particularly disagree with the idea of sprints if they're done in the correct way. I've heard some people say that, for example, they should make sprints only for reserve drivers or only for young drivers to give them some seat time and see who's what and what's where. But then it could just become a F2 copycat, really, and it's just a lot of young drivers crashing into each other because they don't know how to race wheel to wheel. But yeah, I agree with most of the points because Austria is a good track. It's basically just DRS central, which means it's overtakes, which means it's good, which means you get close fights. Lots of drivers overtaking and re-overtaking each other, or at least trying to. Because pretty much if you're on any sort of substantial straight, you're in a DRS zone. And the corners that are in between, they don't really affect your airflow. Maybe turn 6 and 7, and obviously the last 2 corners are a bit bad for dirty air. But obviously with the dirty air being reduced in previous years, I think it's really good for overtaking. And yeah, I think I agree with pretty much every single point you've said there.
I do, yeah, with the sprints. I mean, I've heard the proposals about giving it to the reserve drivers or something. I mean, that sounds quite fun to me. I mean, it would be a very small grid, but you could throw in, it would be what, Jack Doohan, Fittipaldi if he's still a reserve, Schwartzman, that lot. Like a grid of 6 or 7 drivers, or 10 drivers if there's one per team. That'd be kind of fun because they could pick up small amounts of points for their teams. It would be like an extension of the Friday drivers that we used to have in the mid 2000s, who would run a third car in FP1 and FP2, but nothing beyond that. It might help to improve it because otherwise it does just become a predictor of what you expect to happen, which I guess in this case was a sort of good. It boded well because McLaren were obviously close to Red Bull, and that folded out towards the end of the race. So I think we should get to the elephant in the room. So yeah, Max messes up. So Red Bull messed up the pit stop. Max then messes up his outlap. So now Lando has caught him. He made, what was it, 3 attempts to pass him at Ramus. None of them worked. The first one was, they were all, the issue with them is that they were all just not very well executed. It involved him basically just dive bombing him, going straight on, running wide, and then coming back on. The third one is obviously the big one where he tried to go around the outside and got pushed out by Max and they made contact, but they just weren't. We'd seen, I mean, Hamilton made a very tasty move on Sainz, I think, at that corner early on. Oscar made some good moves, and Lando's, they just weren't very well thought out.
Yeah, I mean, those type of dive bombs are only really effective at corners like turn 4 because, if you want to stay on track, that is, because turn 3 is so tight. If you're going to send a dive bomb like that, you have to get it stopped and turn it like it's a tank, and that's not possible because of how tight the radius of that corner is. Something like that at turn 4 would be possible because it's got more curvature to it. It's got less stop and start mechanics to it. And I mean, I think Lando was just being a bit. He was trying to put moves that weren't on, and I think that's part of the reason why it was. That's the reason why it was happening. He was locking up. He was sending it up the inside and just going off circuit. And I mean, Max has done that in the past few years. You look at, for example, with Leclerc in 2019. I can't exactly remember if both of them went off in that instance, or if it was just Leclerc got forced off, but we've seen at that corner drivers pushing each other off and making a hash of it, and then at turn 4 they often spin each other out on the rear right tyre, as we saw with Hamilton and Russell with Red Bulls in consecutive. Was it consecutive? It wasn't consecutive years. It was 2020 and 2022. But I mean, the profile of some of these corners doesn't help. But then again, if it wasn't for the profile of some of these corners, you wouldn't even have overtakes in the first place.
Yeah, it is a very strange corner because the camera angle we saw every time, it's quite a low angle, and you can see actually how cambered the corner is as well, because the drivers kind of bounce over the apex as they go round it, and you can see just how tight it is. But yeah, and with his ones, he was pulling off moves sort of reminiscent of what Kobayashi used to do, but wasn't getting the car to stop in time, and that was. Yeah, that was what was messing it up. He never made any moves into turn 4, because by that point he was behind, and then Max would have DRS. I think would have. Yeah, the DRS rules are funny because it's obviously dependent on the activation point in the run up to turn 3. Is in some cases, the person that is behind at turn 3 has DRS there, and then they have DRS again in turn 4, or they end up getting ahead, mess the move up, and then the person they've just passed gets DRS to pass them again, or is already in front of them and has DRS in the run up to turn 4. It's a bit much because then the main straight has DRS as well, so there's 3 DRS zones, and around this, that's about 60% of this circuit in the end, which kind of messes things up. But yeah, so third attempt, they do make contact when he tries to go around the outside. I was kind of surprised because Max, well, we saw that the tyre came off the rim immediately. He still managed to finish in the points, whereas Lando retired. And I think with Lando, he was trying to push at full speed. He did the classic thing of the tyre delaminates and then starts tearing the floor to shreds, basically driving around like Gilles Villeneuve. And it's like, yeah, I think drivers need to remember, try to avoid that, because he probably could have, had he not done that and just got back out on track, he more than likely would have at least finished in the points as well. I mean, he still would have been behind Max, but it would have been something.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously the contact came, and the thing is, when I watched that on TV and when I've watched it back, I'm not sure if it's just the camera work, but the initial hit doesn't seem very substantial at all. You see them kind of jolt, but you don't see like any cars go up into the air. You don't see any sort of real proper changes in direction. You just kind of see them knock into each other, and then the second piece of contact further around the corner is what kind of sends them into oblivion. And then on the straight, which I'm not sure if many people have really pointed this out because of the contact itself, but Max forcing Lando onto the grass on the curvy straight, you'd say, and then Lando, as you said, coming back to the pits. I mean, I'm not sure if he could have got back, especially not finished in the points, because even after he got back into the pits, I'm pretty sure he was in like 11th anyway. Unless that was...
I'm trying to think because Max was trying to stop him getting through because at first Lando was faster and then Lando's puncture sort of developed in the middle sector. I can't remember now if Max did end up getting ahead of him before they pitted. But there would have been some leeway because the gaps to the cars behind were quite significant at that point. So it's possible. But no, instead they retired the car. Max still salvaged fifth, would have taken the fastest lap as well had Alonso not decided to snatch it for no reason at the end. But yeah, now this became an endless talking point, and this is where again the comparisons to 1995 come into play, because that Hill and Schumacher, they crashed twice in Silverstone and in Italy. I mean, it was a bit more different. It was a bit different that time because in both cases it was obviously Hill's fault, him just ploughing into him from behind. But the comparisons are there to see. And these two, the last few races, they've been fighting closely, and it's like this is going to happen eventually. One thing that's kind of annoying me is that we've got Silverstone coming up this week. All the media is going to be like, oh, great, we've got 2021 again. And you just know on Thursday, it's going to be endless questions to those two about, oh, are you going to crash again? Has this affected your relationship or the way you race each other, blah, blah, blah. That was the thing that annoyed me in the interviews. It was all, oh, are you still going to be friends after this? Like, I don't give a toss if that's not what I'm watching it for.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the are you friends is just kind of, I'm not sure if it's trying to stir the pot or if they're just being stupid because I'm not sure if it's just kind of they're pandering. I think you said this in the bit before, pandering to the Drive to Survive fans crowd where they're all on about friendships and their associations with each other. But yeah, I mean, obviously, regardless of if you're friends off track, going to race each other the same on track because it's the classic adage of when the visor goes down, you're a different animal kind of thing. So kind of friendships are irrelevant essentially. And obviously Silverstone, we've seen in the past few years drivers crashing into each other in championship with championship circumstances changing, and that was 1995 you mentioned, but also in 2021 and I think it could happen again, but I don't think it will because they'll have that in their mind. And if it's in your immediate mind, it very rarely happens again. And we don't know where the cars are going to be. We don't know where the drivers are, because obviously Lando will have the home crowd behind him, but will the McLaren be good on a high-speed circuit? Because Austria and Silverstone are very different circuits. I know the McLaren, I think, overall has the edge, but could certain aspects of a Red Bull and the Verstappen combination at a track where it's not all about the driver, but you can make up a lot as a driver by just being full commitment. Could Verstappen edge it, or will we see it close? Will we see Lando ahead, or will we see Max ahead? We don't know just yet before we get into the weekend.
Yeah, I mean, last year, Lando qualified second. He took the lead at the start and held it for about 3 laps. I've been thinking since McLaren improved, I've been basically convinced he's going to win Silverstone because it does give you an edge, the home crowd and that. And Mercedes are just they're not quite there compared to McLaren on pace. So I think it's very possible he could still win it. I think it's a learning experience for both of them, is that because of how to race each other. But there is differences that, and again, I mentioned in the sprint race, is that Max rarely buckles under pressure and seems to understand. He knows how to place his car quite well. But in the main race, the passes were not very well. They weren't very well executed. He doesn't seem to really understand what you need to do in order to race Max and beat him properly. And he would have been better off probably trying to get maybe deliberately playing DRS chicken and trying the move in turn 4, because he could have got a double case of DRS at that point. It just shows, I guess, a level of inexperience on Lando's part, because it's only really this season that he's actually started putting him in a position to fight for championships. I say fight for championships, is 80 points behind. There isn't a title fight yet, unless Max completely goes off the rails. But it's the first time he's had a car which is obviously fast enough to win races. He's broken the ice by winning in Miami, even though he needed everything to be handed to him on a plate and fall perfectly into place in order for him to do so. Whereas Max has been, he's taken the last 3 championships. He's been fighting at the front effectively his entire career. So he's done all of this before, and Lando is still kind of new to that. And it's going to take a bit of time, I think, for him to adjust to it.
I said while we were chatting before that before the podcast went live, Lando just seems like he's trying to copy what Max does all the time, which is send dive bombs down the inside, changes trajectory before the braking zone, go to the apex of the corner, and then just deal with it when he gets there. See, Max can deal with it when he gets there, but Lando just seems to panic, and that could be his downfall. And obviously, you say there's not a title fight. But, I mean, hypothetically, if Lando was to win every single race in the rest of the season and Max was to finish second, Lando would pull ahead, because I think if Max get outscored, I calculated this on my calculator the other day, if Max get outscored 6.2 points every single race, they'll finish on equal points. Yeah. So that is the difference between first and second. I think that, obviously, Lando just needs to step his game up in terms of wheel-to-wheel racecraft, but it's just an indictment of modern Formula One. Lewis and Max crash with each other because when you're fighting for a title, racecraft seems to go out the window nowadays. I think the only race winner we've had since about 2019, the only clean wheel-to-wheel racer we've had win racers is maybe Bottas, who was a number 2 driver, and Sainz, because the likes of Max, Lewis, maybe even Leclerc have shown at times that they just can't, and Russell especially, have shown that they can't race wheel to wheel to save their lives when they're actually fighting for a win.
Yeah, I mean, well, with Bottas, Bottas has no racecraft at all. He could only win races when Hamilton fucked the startup and everyone else just didn't have the fastest car. Sainz is clean in the sense that he can storm ahead either when the Red Bulls blow up or everyone else is just messing up behind him, and that's enough for him to do it. But yeah, the others are all quite rough around the edges, especially because there are high standards placed upon them, because Max he's the man to beat. Leclerc is the chosen one who's going to bring balance to the Tifosi, and so everyone's waiting for him to get that title with Ferrari. Hamilton obviously has his 7 championships. Lando is the next big up and coming thing, it seems. And he's been the front man for McLaren for quite some time now. So there are different levels of expectations and everything on them. But yeah, the end result, it was funny because the comments afterwards, because Lando, they were asking about, all friends kind of thing with them, and Lando was like, oh well, if he doesn't take any responsibility, I'll lose a lot of respect. So I don't know what that means. And the team bosses, understandably, will side with their driver. That's what they do. And Max was like, "Oh, I don't care. It is what it is." And it's like, well, actually, I suppose in the end of the day, his title lead is now bigger than it would have been had they just finished first and second. So it's a win-win for him.
That's a point I hadn't considered. I mean, I considered that he managed to finish 5th when Lando was out of the race, but yeah. Obviously, that doesn't mean that Team LH is going to go on the blower on Twitter and say, "Oh well, Max did it on purpose, clearly, because now he's got more points than he would have done before." But yeah, I mean, it's just because if this keeps happening, it is just an indictment of modern Formula One, where none of the drivers know how to race each other when they're fighting side by side. I mean, I think Silverstone won't be a repeat, because although it is a track where you can race side by side and it's very high speed and stuff, I think they will have that, even subconsciously, in the back of their minds, like, don't crash into each other again, you're going to look stupid. Because like, if we look at, like, for example, Hamilton and Max's instance, they were all a couple of races apart. Silverstone and Monza were the closest ones, and that's about 4 races. I do think that, yeah, it's just, yeah, getting into the actual incident, I think Max was primarily at fault. Most certainly. I think I'd probably put it 90-10 on him, because Max has always had a problem with moving under braking. I think we can all agree that the moving under braking rules were brought in because he moved under braking a lot in, was it 2018 or 2017?
2015, he was doing a lot of it in his first few races and was getting a slap on the wrist when he was still a rookie.
Yeah.
I think we had the rules before then about don't move in the braking zone. That's been around for quite a long time, as far as I know.
It's just that he's kind of found a loophole to that, where what he does is he changes his line just before the braking zone, darts to usually the inside, and then, because although his line is changing, he's not moving under braking technically, because he's kept the same trajectory. It's a weird loophole that he's kind of found. And that's kind of what he did here in Austria. It was just he was moving to the outside rather than to the inside. He squeezed Lando, and the initial contact didn't seem that substantial, but the second bit of contact where he just kept drifting wide, not necessarily intentionally, it's just a byproduct of when you hit someone at that angle, you aren't going to turn right, you're going to turn left rather than right. I did see, I think it was Matt Gallagher posted a poll on Twitter saying who was at fault for the Max Lando incident, and apparently 40% of people on Twitter think that Norris was at fault for that, and I think that 40% of people on Twitter should be castrated because they shouldn't be able to reproduce if they think that.
I think the first contact, well, that was that took the wheel off, that took the tire off, Max. So that must have been like rim to rim, so head on. The second one, there was a bit of a bump, so obviously one wheel in front of the other, and that was enough to give both of them a puncture. So yeah, quite a small impact because it didn't. Yeah, it was just wheel to wheel. It didn't, damage the bodywork or anything like that. I mean, there are always drivers always love to complain that so and so pushes them off track, and this is the thing with we had the first, was it the first attempt where no the first attempt was when Lando just went straight on and locked up and went off himself. The second one, Max then went wide and kept the lead. And people were saying, "Oh, that should be done for track loads." So I was looking at that thinking, okay, he only went wide because Lando pushed him wide. In that case, they didn't make contact, but it's like the only way he would have not gone that wide would have been to basically come to a halt and let Lando pass him. And I think Lando was trying to say, "Oh, he should give me the place back." It's like, well, he was in the lead the whole time, so he doesn't need to give the place back. Some of these rules about pushing so and so off the track, I mean, this is every driver's favorite pastime, is to go, "Oh, he pushed me off the track on the radio." I get that if you're being pushed onto grass and you might crash the car, if you're being pushed into a barrier, that's not on. But it's like with that, it's just a little bit off. It's fine, to be honest. And that second one was on Lando for me.
Yeah, I mean, I get why drivers go on the radio. It's not because they got forced off. It's the classic football thing of players crowding the referee. It's to get a decision that goes in their favour. It's not because they got pushed off. It's because they want a decision in their favour. And you can't get a decision in your favour by saying, "Oh, he didn't push me off. It's fine." They've got to play it up to be able to for the stewards to look at it seriously, whether rightly or wrongly, whether you think that's sportsmanlike or not. It's just a product of modern Formula One nowadays.
Yeah.
I think it was gonna happen after they were both going at each other. I'm not sure if Max sent one of those crazy kamikaze dive bombs like Lando did. But I wouldn't be surprised if that. I can't get that remember. I think he did do one at least. I did see some people again on Twitter saying that Max should have got more of a penalty because before that he was sending dive bombs and apparently that was dangerous conduct. And it's like, you don't give penalties for an amalgamation of incidents. You give them on the incident separately. It's like if one of them's like a warning and one of them's another warning, you don't then combine them and make it a bigger penalty. It's not a 3-for-1 Tesco meal deal.
Where was Max sending dive bombs? Because he was leading the entire race until that moment. He was moving in the braking zone, obviously, but he wasn't. You can't dive bomb someone you're in front of.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's why I don't understand Twitter, and I think I don't. I do. I'm not sure if it's just me being thick and being on 5 hours sleep, but I remember Max making a move at the inside. Maybe that is just what the case is. But yeah, it's just Max was at fault for the actual incident, but people saying that he should have been penalised or anyone should have been penalised for the stuff before, I think is a bit stupid because nothing actually happened.
Yeah, it's just people getting butthurt. I mean, people were making references to 2021, of course, and Sao Paulo and all of that. It's like, well, funny because in Sao Paulo, in this case, Lando's the one in the wrong if you're going to make that comparison because he was the one that pushed both of them off in the second attempt. But yeah, as well as Max moving and being erratic, Lando was kind of erratic because these dive bombs were just not pulled off very cleanly. I mean, we saw, I mentioned this before, I think it was Lewis did Sainz quite well at that corner. There was a replay that was going around Twitter. I think it was either 2017 or 2018, Vettel pulling off a move on Hamilton at that corner. And in basically an identical fashion to Lewis, to Lando and Max, but without any contact being made. I mean, someone did tweet. It was quite funny. It's like Max and Lando is like Lewis and Nico if they didn't know how to race.
Yeah, I think I saw FP1 Will's comedy review, and apparently he puts a message on from someone saying this is like Senna versus Prost if they were both ass.
Yeah, it's that sort of. It is one of those things. Not obviously, notwithstanding the intentional collisions that Senna and Prost had with each other. But at least they were intentional about it. This was just them fucking up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is gonna be a talking point for the rest of the week. Team LH, yeah, for the rest of the season, Team LH are enjoying this because they're like, now you know how it feels to all the Norris shaggers and or what wannabe shaggers maybe.
14-year-old fangirls, I think is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, and this is the funny thing. Well, I'll mention this a bit later, but after all this, Lando still gets driver of the day because, of course, he gets driver of the day.
I suppose it does. The vote does get done on the final lap, and so you can't. I don't like that, but it's not done like after the race. People don't have time to reflect and look at the people.
It's done within the final 6 or 7 laps. So the vote would have come in just around the time that they collided, probably. Yeah. But yeah, this week with Silverstone, that's all anyone's going to be talking about. But yeah. So, okay, let's look at their teammates. So Piastri, he in the sprint, he finished second. He managed to get himself, when Lando opened the door, he opened the door to him. It was a very good move, turn 4. Quali, he did get done for track limits in the middle sector. And it's kind of funny because that's one of the bits where they put the gravel on, and you can see he's actually touching the gravel. And he has said this, and other people have said this, that maybe the fact that the whole point of gravel is that track limits don't exist anymore because hitting gravel is not going to help you.
Yeah.
Which, to best be, they've taken away a lap which would have put him third in qualifying, which, if anything, was slower than what he would have done had he not violated track limits. And that dropped into what, 7th or 8th?
7th.
In the end, 7th, and it's like there's no logic in that, and it's damaging his form because he hasn't had a clean weekend for a long time now.
Yeah, I said this in my article about the 4 things we learned from the Austrian Grand Prix. So they put in gravel on the exit of the corners to stop drivers from exceeding track limits. Yet they deemed that gravel futile and unimportant and inefficient when in a place where gravel has always existed, or in a place where some sort of deterrent has always existed on the exit of that corner. Like that, he would have undoubtedly, even if minutely, lost time from going on. It's not like he went off the track and somehow managed to skid across it in a way that gained him time because of the wider arc through the corner. He lost time from doing that. Like, you can't enforce track limits on a corner where track limits are already naturally enforced. It's like saying at Monaco, if you hit a wall, you're getting a track limits penalty because you've technically gone outside of track limits. It's
three-place grid penalty next race for crashing, basically.
I do think it's stupid because I think that in general, like lap time, I think in general, regardless of if you go off track, if going off track has made you slower than your previous lap or slower than a representative lap time, I don't think it should be deleted because you've lost time anyway.
I don't think it should be. I don't think track limits should be enforced on the corners that have gravel because it's like there's no possible way of going faster when you're using the gravel. I mean, some of the places we saw when they showed the pictures we've done the gravel here, it's like, okay, they've put the gravel in, but I can still see that as an extremely wide rumble strip that is still wider than the cars. So because the rumble strip in question is about as wide as the car. So there is just enough leeway to touch the gravel and it counts as track limits. But it's being enforced a bit too much. And I'm seeing the same discussion in football. I mean, I can't remember which match, there's been a controversy about VAR again and offside. Because someone was like a toe behind the defender's line, and it's like you have to be a bit more pragmatic. I think drivers like Jody Scheckter has talked about this. One of his complaints is that it's like, okay, yeah, if someone literally cuts a corner and passes someone, you can't do that, and we wouldn't have done that back in our day. But it's like they're like 2 millimeters off the limits. It's like just don't bother. That's way too just anal if you're going to give them a massive penalty for that. And it did just wreck his race because it put him 4 places behind where he should have started.
I mean, I agree with the overall sentiment of track limits are enforced too harshly, but I don't agree with like the whole 2 millimeters thing, because if you allow 2 millimeters, do you allow 3 millimeters? Do you allow 4? When do you stop just allowing it? That's the problem you have with that. I just think the track limits shouldn't be enforced where gravel is, and For example, in Formula 2 and Formula 3, the cars are narrower than F1, so drivers were still getting track limits at the corners they put the gravel in, so there was no point in having it anyway.
Yeah, it's one of the many faults in a modern track design is that this obsession with runoff and gigantic curbs. But it's progress. I mean, we're getting there slowly. But yeah, so with Oscar, he started behind. He did end up making moves up again. There was a very impressive move on Lewis at turn 5, which again you sometimes see moves there, but not very often. He'd gotten himself ahead of Sainz as well. But was just running quietly behind George. Ends up finishing second with their collision. When the both of them were in the pits, and then realized he was only about 2 seconds behind George, and I was thinking, oh, this is interesting because he's on newer tires, which are also newer mediums. When George was on older hards, I was like, okay, well, if you step on it, you could win this. But there's only 5 laps left, and there was the VSC, and George himself stepped on it, so that wasn't enough. But then all you could think is if he had started the race in third, where he should have started it, he would have won this race.
Yes, I agree. I think that he was unlucky, but that's kind of how the dice rolls in F1. I think if McLaren do assert not dominance, but assert a lead in terms of car development, I think that both Lando and Piastri can get wins in the remaining races because we've got 13 more races. We've got plenty more for both Lando and Oscar to win. It's just the cars didn't fall for McLaren today. And also another thing is that George Russell has won 2 more races than Lewis Hamilton has since 2021.
And both of them are in races where Max crashes into someone as well. Yeah. But Oscar with this race was a better one, all things considered. It's just that this year the gap between him and Lando has definitely widened. Last year it was surprisingly even for a rookie. He hasn't really had races this year where he's been obviously better. Maybe this weekend could be an example that without that grid penalty, it would have been a better weekend overall. Certainly in the sprint, and I guess his conduct during the actual race as well. You could argue he was the better driver this weekend, but was just out of position. I think a win will come, but it is a little concerning that particularly he wasn't making up much ground in Spain. He was just behind the whole time in Canada. Miami, that wasn't his fault, but that really messed things up. So it's just not quite happening for him when he should really be right up there. That being said, he's doing a far better job than Checo. I thought Bottas was bad. This is on a whole new level. Max, he does a whole lap on 3 wheels, takes an extra pit stop, gets a 10-second penalty, and he still beats Checo by 15 seconds. It's completely unacceptable now. And this is a man who's just got this 2-year extension when he qualified, 8th, and then he finishes 7th when he should have finished the race in 9th, and he gets beaten by a Haas. And he got his own 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane. It's just beyond help. This is the kind of thing where, and this would have been the case 2 years ago, he should have won this race without those 2 crashing. He was meant to be the one in a position to take it because he has no excuse. Last year, he had no excuse for starting and finishing any lower than 2nd. This year, because of McLaren, there's no excuse for starting or finishing any lower than 4th. And he's just completely out of it. And they'll always blame, the setup was wrong or something is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you obviously just can't. He's obviously playing the Johnny Herbert, Jos Verstappen role of, I can't drive this car, but my teammate can, and makes it work. And it's just getting quite frustrating now.
Yeah, the reason why he's got the contract extension is not because of on-track performance. I think we can all see that. It's because of his value to the Red Bull brand. It's his value because I saw something earlier on. Apparently, he sells 60% of all Red Bull merchandise. All 60% of Red Bull merchandise is Sergio Perez merchandise. And at the end of the day, Max is going to be the only one to fight for this title. And obviously, now, this season you can make the claim that the Constructors' title is up for grabs, but in the previous couple of seasons, it hasn't been up for grabs. So it's much better to get a driver that's not going to threaten Max, that will always obey and will always toe the company and toe the team line, than have a situation like Lando and Oscar, where although it's not the levels of Hamilton Alonso 2007 McLaren taking points off each other, but Piastri could easily in the next couple of in the rest of the season take points off of Lando that eventually, if we do get a title fight, eventually lead to him possibly losing out.
Yeah, I think in the drivers, Max has basically got it, but the constructors, it is still. It's still up for grabs because it's just so. Last year, Max was just doing everything he needed to keep them ahead, but this year it is pretty marginal. So in this race, for example, I think they still outscored McLaren just in the end. So if you add up, let me think about this, 16, 17, they got 25 points for the whole weekend, did Red Bull. McLaren got 18. McLaren actually got 31. So yeah, McLaren did gain on them. Ferrari wouldn't have gained. Mercedes got the most. I mean, they got 25, 37, 45 points for the whole weekend. So in the drivers, Max has a lead of 81 points, and in the constructors, Red Bull have a lead of 64. So not as big. It's still a comfortable lead for the time being, but there is every reason to believe that McLaren at least would catch them. And if they do, it's entirely Checo's fault, as far as I'm concerned.
I can, yeah. I mean, obviously, in a driver's standing, in the drivers' competition, it's a case of obviously if Lando beats Max every single race this season, he'll gain like 7 points a weekend, maybe 10 points if Max has a bad weekend. But in the constructors, if Verstappen finishes first, Norris finishes second. Even if Verstappen finishes first, Norris finishes second, and Piastri finishes third, that's instantly a points game for McLaren, regardless of what Verstappen does, because they have power in numbers and points in numbers. Obviously, Perez might be in the minor points placings to make it equal, but you can't rely on.
He would need to finish sixth or higher for them to match or beat them, which for some reason seems to be an impossible task at the moment. It's a slightly less extreme example of Massa in the V8 era. Of you had Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, and you had what should have been 6 drivers ended up being 5 drivers fighting for wins because Massa was just miles off. It's becoming like that. I mean, with Bottas, okay, yeah, he was a Q3 merchant. Absolutely no racecraft at all. No fight on track. But he at least qualified well, and he at least kept himself in the top 3, even if he finished 30, 40 seconds behind Lewis. In most races, there was the odd one where, like, Baku 2021, it was like, what the hell was that? But it wasn't like every race he was qualifying 8th or 9th and finishing miles down and getting lapped by his teammate. He was at least there, even if he wasn't doing anything. He was just lucky that they had a car that was miles faster than everyone else. But he's become a pay driver. If he's there for merch because there's lots of Mexicans buying Checo caps or something. That's all it is. It's nuts, and it's infuriating because it's like, okay, Tsunoda probably wouldn't be brilliant in that seat, but he'd at least be different. He'd at least put in 100% and try, even if 90% of the time he'd just crash. Though there'd be he would do something and make it interesting, and that would clear a way for Lawson to take the RB seat. They can get rid of Netflix. They can throw in maybe Hadjar or Mart or Iwasa, one of the other juniors, something like that. And it's just we're just clogging it up with drivers that shouldn't be there.
That's what I said in I did a video literally about a few days ago about Daniel Ricciardo, and I basically reiterated the points that you've just said. I said bin off Perez, bring in Tsunoda, because again, people say, oh, Perez is just there to toe the company line and he won't threaten Max. Tsunoda isn't going to threaten Max, and he might get better. There's a chance he might get better results. It's the 2019-2020 what's it called? Train of thought of Red Bull. He could get better results, like they thought with Albon and like they thought with Perez initially. It was just throwing shit at the wall until it stuck, and they're not even trying that now because they just like Perez because of what he brings to the table off track. I do agree with getting rid of Ricciardo. He's like, don't get me wrong, he's had a couple of good run of races, but this is what Ricciardo does. He has a couple of good run of races, then he has a couple of good of shit races, then he has a couple of maybe has one good race, then he has another couple of shit races. He's too inconsistent to be in Formula One, and Jacques Villeneuve was right.
Yeah, I mean now for the latest gossip from Helmut Marko seems to be that he's seeing the light and is like, well, actually, yeah, the logical choice here is Lawson, because the whole point was that Ricardo we would trial him to take Checo's seat, and now we've got Checo for another 2 years. So what's the point? And again, the sort of board at Red Bull were like, the whole point of this team is that it's a junior team. It's not there for people that were in that team 10 years ago and did their time with Red Bull already. But so it's just it's just I've discussed this at length in the previous episodes that with Checo. It's a money thing, but probably also Christian wanting to keep his friends close because everyone's in the know about all the horner stuff, and he's trying to keep that down, because that scandal that was huge in the first 2 races, and then it just vanished without a trace, and now no one's talking about it anymore. Other than the latest thing, I think, was that Jerry, apparently she called herself Jerry Halliwell for some magazine thing spread she did or whatever. And yeah, I have no doubts that she walks around Bahrain holding his hands, but back home she's throwing crockery and chinaware at him and stuff like that across the room.
Throwing WhatsApp text messages at him.
Yeah.
It's not a great situation to be in for any Red Bull driver, because if you have Ricardo and Perez in the teams, what precedent does it set for the likes of Hadjar, for the likes of Iwasa? As much as I don't like Hadjar because I think he's a whining gimp and he needs to shut up 95% of the time. He's a good driver, although he has a massive nose, and he's just. I mean, Iwasa I'd put over Hadjar because he's got more experience and he's in Super Formula now. I'd probably put Verstappen and Tsunoda in Red Bull for next year if I had the choice to burn Christian Horner at the stake. I'd then take Lawson and Iwasa, put them in because Iwasa's more experienced than Hadjar. Give Hadjar more time to develop in F2, and then that'll be it. Because I think they've got Jack Crawford in F2 as well.
He's an Aston Martin junior now.
That's me being stupid then. Yeah.
Well, to be fair, it's like a sieve, the Red Bull junior team, which I'm doing in my next video. Yeah, he left at the end of last year. He's now one of the Aston Martin juniors. Not that that's a complete dead end. Him and Drogovic is like, what's the point when both Alonso and Stroll have been given contract extensions of an indeterminate length. But yeah, so it's a funny situation, but it's just hopefully they see the light, and maybe they will. If he starts really jeopardizing their title chances, maybe they will just tear that up. Who knows? But yeah, okay. So Mercedes, the surprise winners of the weekend, a second win for George. A year and a half after the first one. Over the past few races, they've obviously sorted the car out. It's taken 2.5 years, but I think they finally cracked ground effect, and they seem to understand the car and how to make it work. And there is quite a noticeable gap, though, is that George seems to have worked it out more than Lewis. In Canada, especially. I mean, I thought Lewis didn't drive too badly. He was very self-critical. Lewis ended up beating him had a better strategy in Spain after that lightning fast start that George had. But today, the gap was quite significant. I mean, qualifying, he was only a little bit behind George, but then George was just running by himself in third, inherited the win, and it's like, okay, didn't really deserve the win, I guess, but he was in the position to take it as something happened up the front, unlike Checo and unlike, so good on him. Lewis, at the start, he passed Sainz off track at turn 1. He ran very wide and passed him. He gave the position back to avoid a penalty, but then he crossed the white line on his pit entry and took a 5-second penalty because of that. And so that just kind of left him in no man's land, and he got 4th when we've otherwise been 6th.
Yeah, I mean, Lewis is just nowhere at the moment. I like, usually when Lewis has had his off years in the very rare occasions where the car hasn't been up to scratch, like the first part of 2009, where he was actually, I've looked back at the stats because of my video I did on him, and there were times where he was like, there were several races in a row in 2009 where he was getting beaten in qualifying and the races by Kovalainen, and he's doing the same thing again this year. He just can't seem to catch it. It's not like we've seen previously where he's shown glimpses of properly good drives. He's just shown nothing this year. This realistically was a perfect chance for him to show what he's capable of, because like we had a crash up front, if there was no pressure on him otherwise, and he made well, he made them. I've seen people on Twitter saying that Mercedes were a bad strategist because they told him to let Sainz through, and it's like, well, would you rather risk a 5 second time penalty, or would you rather, just lose maybe a second, giving the position back, which just sums up how stupid and retarded Team LH is. But yeah, I mean, Lewis just needs to kick himself in the head and actually start performing well, because it's all good being self-critical and saying, oh, I had a shocking weekend, but unless you actually do something about it, then you're not going to move forward.
Yeah, I think there's a lot at play this year. I mean, okay, first of all, he's not in the fastest car, so that alone seems to make a huge difference when he spent 90% of his career driving the fastest car. He's the outgoing driver, so even though he's been their lead driver and their most successful driver for years now, there is no reason to be loyal to him when George is the future, and they've also got to think about whenever they're going to give that seat to Andrea Kimi Liuzzi. And I think another thing that maybe people don't want to accept is maybe he is just past his best at this point. He's going to Ferrari next year. I don't think it's going to be a miracle. He's going to a completely different environment. It's his first time not racing without Mercedes behind him it'll have been nearly 30 years as well. And that he's going there knowing that it's Leclerc's home ground. Leclerc is the lead driver. It's built around him. So I'm not expecting it to go particularly well, even if they do snatch up Newey. But I think it is just now. He's 39 years old now, and I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. It's just he doesn't have everything falling into place for him anymore, and that's half the reason that people say there have been several opportunities for him to win races over the past 2.5 years that haven't come to fruition. It's like, yeah, because he normally needs everything to fall perfectly into place, such as his opponents have their cars break down, or there's a safety car that comes just when he's about to pit, or whatever it is, and that's just not happening now. And it's meant he's 2-0 down on George, even though George has needed things to fall into place, because as I mentioned, he only wins races when Max crashes into somebody. The sabotage allegations, it's just Team LH, though, claiming, the reason he's so off is because of that. And it's like, he's not even that much off. He's maybe a tenth or two at the most in qualifying off George, which is nothing. It's just that it feels like more because this year the gaps are obscenely close. I mean, in Q1 there was less than a second between the whole grid, which is just unreal. If they were genuinely sabotaging him, I think he would notice, and the gaps would be so much bigger as well.
Yes. I mean, the one thing that people haven't really mentioned about Lewis is he's in his 18th season of Formula One. He's had the longest consecutive period in Formula One history, joint most consecutive, I should say, because Barrichello had 19 seasons, actually, didn't he? It was
93 to 2011.
Yeah. And technically, Graham Hill had 18 seasons, even though for 1975 he was doing a part-time campaign. And I think for 58 and 59 he also did a part-time campaign, so maybe not Graham Hill.
Yeah,
but
with far fewer races in a season.
But yeah, I mean, I just think, I do agree that Lewis has passed it. He doesn't, even though I don't think he's a terrible driver, he just doesn't have the same drive. He doesn't have the same aura, you could say. I mean, I know aura is the kind of word they throw around in football. He doesn't have the same just aura that he had 2 or 3 years ago. He doesn't have the same motive, the same drive. I don't think, unless Ferrari come out of the gates in 2025 or 2026 with the fastest car on the grid, I don't think he even has a peep of beating Leclerc, because I don't think, obviously Leclerc is the number 1 driver at the moment, the golden boy. I think they'll be equal status when Lewis gets there, because Lewis isn't going to accept being a number 2 driver. And I don't think Leclerc will accept being a number 2 driver either, so they'll probably be equal status. But Lewis has proven that when he's not the number 1, when he's not got everything falling into place, like you said, he doesn't perform. And that's why, that's part of the reason why I think he's nowhere near GOAT status. So that's why I think he's 7th on my all-time list of all-time F1 drivers.
I think Abu Dhabi 21, it basically broke him, and that's been compounded by the car being half useless. I mean, it's the cars they've had are not nearly as bad as both themselves and their fan base have made out to be. And I mean, the beginning of last year, Mercedes had to send out that apology letter to their fan base. Sorry that we've only got the 4th fastest car. Sorry we're in the same position that we were in the V8 era of, the occasional podium, but usually in the top 8 at least. And they would just complain endlessly how awful this car is. And it's like, it's not the Williams. Get over yourself. And again, they only carried themselves usually because, I mean, aerodynamics were good, not as good as Red Bull, because they had these really powerful engines that they'd spent 7 years developing. So it's no wonder they were always so competitive. But yeah, with the dynamic at Ferrari will be interesting, because they'll try and both be number one. Lewis is going in there with his mentality of, oh, we need more diversity in the team. It's like, I don't think that's going to help them, to be honest. There are lots of things that that Ferrari needs fixing, but I don't think telling them that it needs fewer Italians is going to work, to be honest. But him and Charles dispatched to Vettel, and Vettel had been the lead driver there for several years already, so I don't think he'll have many problems doing the same to Lewis, who's going to be completely new to the team.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit different because Vettel was already on his downturn by that point. I think 2017 and 2018 he had good moments, but he was too inconsistent to actually challenge for a title. Then in 2019, he had his good moments. I think wet weather races was part of his repertoire, where he was just not spinning when everyone else was, and just getting like seconds, and not first in 2019, not in wet races anyway. And then I think 2020 was when he properly started to go downhill, and that's when Charles finally got definitely the most of the upper hand on him. I don't think Charles will have as much of an upper hand on Lewis, because I don't think Lewis is as much in his downward spiral as Vettel was at that point in his career. I think Lewis, I mean, as I said, I think if Ferrari just come out of the gates with a really fast car, I think he could maybe challenge Leclerc, but I think over a season, Charles would beat him out, because I think just like, as I said, when he comes up against the title fight, like you look at, he's lost to Nico Rosberg, he's lost to Jenson Button over a season. He's lost to he's either been equaled by or lost to more than half of his teammates over the course of their time together, for at least one season. Like he got equaled by Alonso, he got beaten by Button in 2011, he got beaten by Rosberg, and he got beaten by Russell in 2022, and arguably in 2023, even if Lewis was more consistent. I think easily the same could happen with Leclerc. And again, this is me ranting again. This is part of the reason I don't think he's the GOAT. He's nowhere near GOAT status, because none of the other your Schumachers, your Prosts, your Fangios, your Sennas, apart from Prost and Senna and Lauda and co battling against each other as teammates, none of them ever lost to their teammates. And Lewis has done it to four guys, only one of which you could argue is up there with the greatest, and that's Alonso.
Yeah, it's a thing I highlighted in my video about every champion's best and worst races, is that a lot of the best races I'd chosen came in years when they didn't win the championship. And what stood out to me was their ability to basically perform and deliver when they were on the back foot and didn't have all the best machinery and everything. And with Lewis, there aren't many examples of him doing that when he hasn't had the fastest car. And so I feel like to put him in that kind of position, you would have expected performances similar to, say, Donington 93 or Spain 96, that sort of thing, over these past 2.5 years, when the car is normally not the fastest, but there's an occasional race where he just pulls this master stroke or something, and it just hasn't happened. There's been the odd race where maybe if things fell slightly more his way, he could have won it, but only just. But it hasn't really been a brilliant couple of years for him.
Yeah, it really hasn't. Like, if I was to look at Lewis's best races, obviously, I think you said Silverstone 2008 was his best race, didn't you? And I have to agree with that. But apart from that, I can't think of any like standout races. Like with Senna, you have Donington 93, you have Monaco 1988 qualifying, you have all the Monaco races you could possibly say. With Prost, you have 1990 Mexico, you have loads of other races. Schumacher 96 Spain. I'm trying to think of other ones where 2005 San Marino, that was where he lost to Alonso. Maybe not that one, but all of the champions is what I'm trying to say. They all have an array and a litany of fantastic performances where you go, that guy is the best in the world, or that guy at one point was the best in the world. Whereas Lewis only has one, and that's Silverstone 2008, and all the others were, yes, great, maybe even good, or good, maybe even great, but just not really like properly legendary drives. I think the perfect example of that is Singapore 2018. I think Lewis fans have kind of made Singapore 2018 Lewis's Senna 1988 Monaco or Verstappen 2021 Jeddah if he didn't crash moment. even though he only outqualified Bottas, who didn't win a single race that year, by 7 tenths and only got pole by 3 tenths. It wasn't exactly a great performance.
Yeah, I mean, that one, it's more the qualifying lap that was what people out for that. Because in the race itself, he just led from the front. And that's the case with the majority. I think about his wins from pole percentage, it's higher than Schumacher, Vettel, and Verstappen. Senna has the highest. Senna's on like 75% of his wins came from pole. I think it's less than 50% for Prost. It's about 60%.
What's Seb?
Seb, he's about 52, 53%. Again, with Seb, he never won a race from lower than third, whereas the others have all had. I mean, Hamilton has a win from 14th. Max has won from almost every position from first to 12th or something. Schumacher has a win from 16th. Lewis, most of the really great guys, it tends to be the wet races that come out, because the other ones like Fuji 07, people talk about, Turkey 2020. A lot of his other big wins are ones where he basically led from the front, or it was him having to sort of win the psychological battle over Nico Rosberg, or benefiting off misfortunes from other drivers. A huge factor in his performance in Germany 2018 was Vettel, crashing out from the lead, for example.
Yeah, Lewis is just an anomaly. Like, for the performances that you see, both statistically and contextually, the performances and the anecdotes, he looks like a 2 or 3 time champion, not a 7-time champion who has all the records in Formula One. Like, the video I did on Hamilton saying he wasn't anywhere near GOAT status, people saying lol, people were just Hamilton fans just putting hate comments saying lol, 103 and still counting. And it's like, yeah, well, if you're in the era in Formula One where you have the most races every season and you have the most seasons in a race winning car, of course you're going to have the most wins. Like, Lewis has won 7 out of his 11 championship winning seasons. Schumacher got 7 from 9. Prost got 4 from, I think, 6. Senna got 3 from, I think, 6 as well, but because he was fighting against Prost. Lauda got 3 from 3. Like, you look at all the other guys, they've had more percentage records than Lewis has.
I think that the driver, the highest win percentage is Fangio. He's on, it's over. Yeah. It's about a little over
47%.
47%, so just under, 25 wins from 2 starts, or 51, something like that.
Yeah, 24 from 51, I think it is.
Lewis, I think he may have just dipped below. He's now dipped below 30%. He was, and at his peak by the end of 2020, I think he was on about 35%, but he's now gone down to under 30%. It's again, and this is the same thing. It's benefiting Max is having this many wins in the season, because Max is on 61 wins. He's 30 away from Schumacher, so by the end of 26, he could have overtaken both Schumacher and Hamilton, because there's going to be there's over 50 races for him to do that in, and it's just how it falls. Like, if Hamilton, if you tried to transpose Hamilton's results to the 1950s. He'd have probably about 30 to 40 victories, career wins in total, something like that. Not over 100, and that would be much more in line with your Fangios and your Prosts, not Clark and people like that.
I'll tell you one thing because I have a stat sheet because I'm a massive autistic nerd about like all the different like results drivers have had. Fangio had a finishing percentage of 86% throughout his career, which was substantially high for the 1950s.
Yeah, at a time when the cars, I mean, reliability actually got worse for a while and then picked up in the late 80s when they got rid of turbos. But yeah, that's enormous for the 1950s, because in most cases reliability was horrendously bad. Whereas we've seen now reliability is near perfect now. I mean, in the race yesterday, the only non-finisher was Lando, and that was because of a crash, and he was still classified. The cars just don't break down anymore, when they used to do it all the time. I don't know how it is, but suddenly they fixed this. The world's greatest engineers have spent 70 years not knowing how to build an engine or a gearbox that can run for 90 minutes without any problems, and suddenly they've worked it out.
Yeah, I mean, for the first 55 years of Formula One, I think it was up until the 2005 United States Grand Prix, only one race ever had no retirements, and that was in 1961. Was it Belgium or the Dutch Grand Prix? Because it was a race where they had no pit stops, no overtakes, and no retirements. It was weird.
Yeah, I mean that would have been a field. I mean, at the time the field would have been probably approximately 10 to 15 drivers, so a smaller grid. But yeah, it took that long. And again, that was the first one. I think Italy 2005 was the only other race after that with no retirements, and then we had like Europe.
In 2011,
Europe 2011, and then it didn't take it, and then we didn't start getting them again until into the hybrid era after that. Yeah, it's kind of insane that reliability has just gotten so good now, and it makes it very hard for the back marker team to
do anything.
but yeah. Okay, right. We're over an hour in, and we've only covered 3 teams, so let's move on. Ferrari.
Yeah.
So in this sprint, they fell behind a bit, and both of the drivers were just saying, "Oh well, we're just not quick enough." They did some setup work again, and in quali they seem to have fixed that because they got, what was it, fourth and fifth, something like that for quali. Fourth and sixth. So yeah, sandwiching Lewis. So not bad. And then, but at the start, Leclerc had contact with Oscar, and it was a very light contact, but it was enough to take an end plate off, and so he had to pit and fell behind. But then there was this. They decided, oh, let's not run long. Let's put him on this aggressive 4-stop strategy, which meant that he went from a net P19 to P13, but ends up finishing 11th in the end. But just made no progress at all, which really kind of shocks me.
Yeah, you'd expect with a strategy like you say 4 stops. I didn't actually see how mental that was. 4 stops. You'd expect to at least I'm not sure how far he was behind the pack after or how much he lost. Obviously, in the pits, he'd have lost a lot more compared to everyone else because I don't think anyone did anything more than a 2-stop. But yeah, you should have just gone long on the hards and just seen what happened realistically, and probably come into it for the mediums towards the end. That's what I'd have done. But then again, I'm not an F1 strategist. But then again, I'm still better than any Ferrari strategist.
Yeah, I mean the hard tyres were not very good this weekend, and he pitted and put those on, probably trying to run long, and then he pitted again after like 15 laps at the same time that everyone else was pitting. And it just meant by this point he was about 30, 40 seconds behind the pack or something. He was gaining relatively quickly to the back of it, but he would make positions and then pit again and set himself back. And it was only in that final stint when he put softs on that he did suddenly make some moves up. But I was expecting them to retire him because, maybe I imagine they were anticipating a safety car and something would help. No safety car came, but even with that collision at the end, he still only came 11th. So it was just another wasted weekend where he's fallen out of this. If there is a title fight, it's a 2-horse race now between Lando and Max. Sainz, however, a bit more of a quiet race because, again, as we said, Hamilton passed him at the start. He then gave him the position back. And then he just broke ahead and did his thing. And there's not,
just anonymous Sainz, typical anonymous Sainz, where he's doing good, but he's just there. He's not doing badly. He's not doing overly well. It's just Ferrari, I think, are definitely 3rd or 4th quickest because at the start of the season they were definitely 2nd best, and now they're potentially even 4th best. They've just kind of dropped off. Or stagnated, more likely, because all the other teams around them improved.
It's very. I mean, at the top 4, it's very close together, but there is a definite break in that it's McLaren and Red Bull, and then Mercedes and Ferrari. It's just slightly behind. It's the problem that the pace is not abnormally slower, but because the field spread is so small, and because reliability is so good, and because they're having to battle a very competitive McLaren and a very kind of indomitable Verstappen, you can't have any slip ups. And they know that, and so now they've become 3rd to 4th fastest, and they're in a position where they're even lucky to get podiums now. I mean, we saw it wasn't a brilliant performance in Spain as well. I was thinking, oh, maybe Sainz can win his home race, and then he finished behind Leclerc in 5th or 6th. So it was a race where the podium flatters them. Really, he should have finished 5th, but a pretty quiet one all round, and just more funny strategy moments. And with Leclerc, it was unfortunate, but that's how the dice roll. Something.
Yeah, it is just. Yeah, I mean, even if he'd have done, like, for example, a medium strategy, or he did do the medium strategy, like you said, and if the cards had fallen in his right way, he wouldn't have finished ahead of Sainz. He could have maybe got a 6th or a 7th. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, the cars just didn't fall right for him. Hopefully, it will work better in Silverstone. But then again, we don't know what Mercedes are going to bring. We don't know what Ferrari are going to bring because of how tight it is, like you mentioned. It's a crapshoot, really.
Yeah, and it did only serve to damage the constructors that they got only 15, 19, 21 points across the whole weekend. So less than McLaren and Red Bull.
Mercedes would double that.
Yeah. So it only meant that, and they're the ones currently in second. And as I said, they're now 64 points behind Ferrari. They're still 23 points ahead of McLaren. So even with McLaren getting 5 consecutive second place finishes in a row, they're still that much ahead. I guess because Ferrari have 2 wins and McLaren only have 1, even though Ferrari had, Canada was nothing, Spain wasn't brilliant.
Then again, Piastri hasn't been overly great this season, I suppose.
Yeah, that's what's making the difference. I think is that's kept them in the fight still, and it's keeping them in the fight because of that.
Yes.
Okay, so then next up, and then I'd say obviously the best of the rest team is Haas. Very good weekend for them. They really seem to have found their mojo since they got rid of Gunter. Things are working far better for them. This except for 2019, this is one of their strongest circuits. I mean, in 2018 they finished 4th and 5th. 22 was when Mick suddenly decided to be like his dad, and he was making moves in the sprint and in the race and beat Lewis and did all of that. It was 6th and 8th beating Checo. There was some close bits. I think they came out of the pits very close together at one point, and that but quali could have been better, but they got themselves in they got ahead of Alpine, and very, very good. 6th and 8th is one of the best results they've had in a very long time.
Yeah, they finally capitalized on a race where other people have done stuff wrong rather than being the people that do the stuff wrong, in a way. Hulkenberg, again, proving why he's not one of the most underrated drivers, but definitely an underrated driver on the F1 grid. He's kind of goes under the radar because people think he's shit because he's never got a podium, not realizing that you don't need to get a podium to be a fantastic driver, not with the cars he's been in. And Magnussen, for once, not either A, putting it into the wall, or B, putting it into another driver, and actually getting a points finish for once. I mean, although I desperately want Oliver Behrman to take that seat for next season, Magnussen is starting to up his performances now.
Yeah, they haven't decided to just use him as a battering ram for the past couple of races. But it's they kind of got it together. I mean, to be fair, this is their first. I mean, we've seen, if just looking at their results, this is their first double points finish since Australia. It's their first points in the main race since China. So actually, it's just a significant improvement. It seems to be, this is one of these circuits that's kind of a Marmite circuit in that it either works for you or doesn't. Because Mercedes, and Toto said this in the interview yesterday, this has often been one of their weakest circuits. Again, for Hamilton, it's been one of his weaker circuits. But Haas, it works well for them in the past, except 2019, as I mentioned. And they managed to just capitalize on that. A bit more so than who have become essentially their main rivals, which is Alpine. So they finished 10th and 12th, I believe. They have made significant improvements since the beginning of the season when they were the slowest team by quite some margin. This weekend wasn't quite so strong for them. They're still effectively the best of the rest. But they had, I mean, they only got the points because of the collision again. Without that, it would have been 12th and 14th. Again, they were squabbling, and actually, I think it was them, it was the Haas. When Max was complaining about his tyres, that he had both Haases behind him trying to unlap themselves or something. Alpine, even if things are a mess off track, on track they are at least trying to put in the hard graft and deliver, I suppose.
Yeah, they have definitely decided to actually pull their finger out since about Canada, maybe slightly before that, when they started racking up points for the first time. Obviously, we know Ocon's not going to be there next year. Gasly is going to be there next year, and yeah, it seems ever since Flavor's come back on board, they've just pulled their finger out. I said before we went on air that Flavio Briatore's probably pulled them both in a room and said that if they don't start performing well, then he's going to pull their fingernails out. But I mean, I hope Alpine do well, because although they're French, they have said since 2016, we've got a 5-year plan to win the Constructors' Championship. And then they said, "Oh, we've got a 5-year plan to win the Constructors' Championship," and they're just the French version of Toyota by this point.
Yeah, they're not making, from a marketing perspective, it's really not a very attractive team because their drivers hate each other. They squabble on track. The team principal seems that, he hates one of the drivers. It's quite refreshing that he's actually how outspoken he is. I mean, it's only to the French media that he's like that, but it doesn't help their image, particularly as they keep firing every other week. They're fired a new engineer or someone's left, and then they brought back bloody Flavio Briatore, and you forget how long he's been out of the game. because he's been gone since it's been 15 years now. I think he's made the odd appearance in the paddock just to attend races as a spectator since then. He's back as a special advisor, and so now this is looking at this and it's like, oh well, they're trying to bring back the old gang. Maybe they'll try and find room for Pat Simmons somewhere. His ban on the paddock was lifted in 2013, and before that he'd been working with Virgin. It's a funny relic from the past to bring back, I guess.
Yeah, I remember you talking about Pat Simmons in your Virgin video. I remember you talking about him. But yeah, I mean, if they do that and it works, there's no problem to complain, because I do think, because Flavio's skill set was never actually influencing on track performance. It was the people he brought around him. It was the aura it was the mindset he brought, and it was because he was never an engineer himself. He never had any actual background in Formula One. He was hired by the Benetton family to run the team, because his skill set was in hiring people that he knew would do the job, not actually doing the job himself. I think he's kind of like a Lawrence Stroll kind of character, where he knows that he's not got the best skill set in the world. He just hires people who do have a better skill set than him and know what they're doing. He's just very much he's a mafia boss, and he's unhinged, and I think that's what gets results, because he just cuts through all the bullshit.
He just has a business head. That's the thing. Yes. He knows how to lead. That's one of the key things, is that knowing how to lead a company or an empire without necessarily having all the expertise, but listening to building a team that are the experts and listening to them and getting their advice and all of that. And I think we also have to remember that with Team Enstone, the only time that they've ever actually been good was under his leadership in the 90s and 2000s. That's the only time they've actually been properly. It's just it makes people think all anyone's going to associate him with now is Crashgate from now on. And so maybe we'll see an Alpine win in Singapore this year. I don't know. Gasly can get a win. But for Alpine, not quite as on the ball as the past couple of weeks. Especially, I mean, they had an exceptional race in Spain, but still not bad.
Yes.
So next up, then, I guess would be RB or VCarb, Minardi, Toro Rosso, whatever you want to call them.
These are cash up shitting donkeys, is what I like to call them.
Yeah. I just say Toro Rosso. But so they had, so in the main race, we had a 9th place from Ricciardo. Tsunoda was not 13th. He was 14th. Well, before the race kicked off, Tsunoda got himself in some hot water for saying, "What is he retarded?" Blah 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 to Joe in qualifying, I think it was. A lot of people decided to be offended by that, and he was given a fine of £40,000 or dollars for that, for break obscene language or whatever. And it's funny because it's the amount of people that got offended by it, and I'm just thinking to myself, okay. The FIA, they choose what does and doesn't get broadcast on the main feed in terms of radio messages, so they could have just ignored that. I mean, people could have still theoretically found it on F1 TV when you watch the onboards, because you get all the you get all the radio messages in that, and it's like, okay, people have said this before, put radios on football players during matches, or give the drivers radios from the 1980s earlier, and let's see what they have to say over it.
I mean, I can speak as a disabled person. I am very much a believer in, if you have intention to cause harm, then you're a dick. But if you don't have any intention to cause harm, English is possibly his second or even his third language. Like, probably his second, because English is a very worldwide language. But he's not meant to know the origins of that word. And even if he did, he's come out and said, "Look, I didn't know what this meant. I've apologized. Let's move on." But he shouldn't have had to apologize in the first place, because there was no intention behind it. If he'd gone up to who was it that he was it one of the Alpines?
When
who he called a retard?
I thought apparently it was Joe. I've forgotten who it was. It was someone who blocked him, I think. Yeah,
well, like, it's not like he's gone up to him in the paddock and got a walking stick and handed it to him and said, "You're a retard." He's just said it in a passing way. It's not like you can call someone, for example, a bitch without being misogynistic. You can call a man a bitch without being misogynistic. So why is it different when it's about a word that not many people like? It's just because people can't seem to accept that some people may have different opinions to them.
And context and intent are very important. Obviously, the intent was, I guess, malicious in one sense that it was aimed at a specific person. Joe himself, I mean, is not somebody who has any mental or physical disabilities or anything. So it's just that I had a tweet that blew up. I managed to ratio somebody called Last Lap Lucy, who she took offense to this, and then I just responded, it's like, well, I'm autistic as well, but I wasn't offended because it wasn't aimed at me. Like,
I'm autistic and I've got cerebral palsy, so I can double up and say it's not offensive.
Yeah, it's just it's at the end of the day, you choose whether you get offended by these things or not, even if it's something even if it is malicious and it's like, and it is aimed, and it's if it's pick a racial slur, for example, it's like you're not
board game.
if you're a member of whatever racial category that's aimed at, it's like you're not obliged to be offended by it. You can choose not to be offended by this. And some people just have thicker skin than others. I mean, I got bullied a lot in primary school because of I'm autistic, and you just develop a thick skin because of that. And it was a huge fuss over nothing, because the drivers always say things that their language is always a bit more extreme when they're in the car and stuff. They say things they wouldn't say in person. It's like it's the same with gaming lobbies. People say things they would never say in person. It's that sort of...
I mean, it's definitely a deep rabbit hole that you can go down in terms of what should we be stopping, or what should we be policing, and what shouldn't we be policing. Because, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a thing in NASCAR where Kyle Larson got banned for the entire next season for saying the N-word during COVID and a live streaming when he was doing some iRacing races. Like, I mean, I can sort of understand where they're coming from in terms of that, because obviously the N-word is pretty much it's as far as you can go when he's white. When that's pretty much the worst you can go in terms of slurs and in terms of derogatory remarks. So he got done for possibly the worst derogatory slur, and got possibly the worst punishment that a driver's ever got in major motorsports for that sort of thing. But where do you draw the line? Do you... Obviously, Yuki's got fined 40 grand or whatever it is for calling someone a retard. Do you find someone for less money for calling someone like a mong, which is a bit worse, which is less offensive? Do you find someone for calling someone stupid? Like, where do you draw the line? And who's going to police where you draw that line? Because no one can police it, really.
I mean, Max didn't he call Stroll a Mong or a Mongol or something?
In 2020, I've just remembered, yeah.
Yeah, and everyone kicked up over that, and I was like, apparently in Dutch, everyone does that all the time. It's one of these things.
It's an unhinged language, and everyone calls everyone everything.
I think it's also, that's the thing, that this is where there are cultural differences. The different countries have different standards about words you can and can't use. For example, spaz. You're not supposed to use that in the UK. Again, I'm autistic, so that basically gives me license to. But in America, it's fine over there. But in the UK, you're never supposed to say anything is spastic or call anyone that or whatever. It's one of that's just an example of it. It was just a bit much over a fairly at the end of the day, it was a fairly minor offence as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I call inanimate objects retarded. Yeah, how it is. Yeah.
But part of the way I police it, not obviously, this isn't just it's never just a one size fits all. But if I could replace it with another word and not be offended, like, it's all about the context. As I said, if I could call something or someone a fag or a bitch or whatever, if I could replace that with any other word, would I be offended? And if the answer is no, then it's not offensive for me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, he could, if he wanted, he could have just said, "Is he slow?" It would have had a double meaning. Everyone would have taken that, is he just driving slowly? But it would have been the less offensive term in that context.
Or dense or whatever, I don't know, yeah.
Oh, yeah, dense is fine. That's not, no one's offended by. Anyway, back to on-track stuff. The race, I mean, Ricciardo, he finished 9th when he should have finished 11th. He's going to say, I'm back again, even though he's hopefully hanging by a thread at this point. Yuki, was he the one that got twatted by Alonso at turn 3?
No, I think was that Joe. I think it might have been Joe.
Oh no, that was Joe. Yeah, no, not Yuki. Yeah, so okay, not a really. I mean, last week was an absolute train wreck for RB, second slowest team after bringing upgrades. This was better, but they've fallen off when they've fallen from best of the rest, and now they're like 8th fastest or something when they were scoring points quite regularly before that. So yeah, just not. Yeah. They got a little bit from it, but again, still things are not going particularly well for them at the moment.
Yeah, either they've gone backwards or the teams around them have just improved, like your Alpines and your Haas's and people like that. Yeah, I mean, Ricardo's starting to do well over these past few races. I will give him that. As much as I like to bash him for only ever consistently beating only one of his teammates throughout his entire career in both qualifying and race trim, that being Esteban Ocon in 2020, he's started to perform as well as you'd expect an 8-time Grand Prix winner and a guy who people rate so highly against Yuki Tsunoda, who is pretty much your most C-tier, mid, not mid is in terms of bad, but mid in terms of middle ground, yardstick driver. He's now starting to perform better than him. Whether he can keep up this pace is the thing, because like I found this is the first time he's outperformed a teammate in 3 consecutive races since 2020, like since he was against Ocon. And for me, he's just like, if he can keep up this form for the rest of the season, fine. Keep him in the RBC, even if he's not going to go anywhere, because he's not doing too bad. I mean, I would put Lawson in there, but it wouldn't be a travesty to put Ricciardo in there. But if he just keeps going down like he has been over the past few seasons, or like he has done like over the past since basically his entire career, where he has off periods, then just bin him off. He's 34, going to be 35 next year. Lawson is, I'm not sure exactly, I think he's 22 or 23. He's about 10 or 15 years his junior, and he's performed better recently in the couple of races he did. Get him in and actually bring some freshness, some insight, and some good performances into the team.
Yeah, at this point, a driver of his experience and his reputation, he shouldn't be beating Yuki. He should be demolishing him. And he's beating him every once in a while, but his performances are extremely inconsistent. I mean, we've seen the last 4 races, 12th, 8th, 15th, 9th. They're just all over the place. And it's also just, he shouldn't be there on principle, because it's not designed for drivers like him. It's designed for drivers like Lawson, and that alone is reason to get rid of him. But yeah, he's there because of its marketability, and he's just such a profoundly uninteresting driver. So I've never even understood the marketing side. Yeah,
because he smiles a lot, and because he's good for. I mean, he was remotely attractive in his younger days as well. So I suppose as part of that, the pretty tax, or whatever you call it. But this is another argument that I made. People go on at Lance Stroll and absolutely berate him for only having one good performance a year, usually. And then when Daniel Ricciardo does only one good performance a year, they're like, "Oh, you need to give him more time." Jack Villeneuve was completely right.
I think this was his 250th race, wasn't it? Or maybe last weekend was it? So that puts him, I think, within the top 20 most experienced drivers of all time now. He doesn't need more time. It's time to go and create space for other people. But yeah, you mentioned Stroll, so let's talk about Aston Martin. Things are really not going well for them. This was pretty horrendous. Yeah, especially Alonso. I mean, he made it to Q2. Stroll got knocked out in Q1. In the sprint, Stroll was 9th, and Nando was 15th. So that's quite a 10th and 15th. So that's quite a significant gap. And yeah, in the race, they've fallen off. But they used to be 4th fastest. Even at the beginning of the season, they were still roughly fourth fastest, and now they've just it's completely plummeted. And Alonso, he smashed into Joe, and then they pitted him at the end just so he could steal fastest lap for no reason.
Shits and giggles.
Yeah, it's astonishing that this downturn has happened. Well, it was a few weeks ago now that Alonso signed his indeterminate extension, and then Lance has re-signed. I mean, his contract length is however long Daddy stays, basically, is how that works. But it's becoming such a shambles. Every time they bring upgrades, the car gets worse, and they don't know what they're doing. And Alonso, he's not going to want to stick around much longer, I don't think, in a car like this. Yeah.
So you say Alonso has an indeterminate length on his contract. Because I was doing my article and I was mentioning Alonso because of his bad performance, it was particularly notable. I saw it. I swear I remember because I thought at the time he's signed a contract to go on until 2026. Apparently, that's what F1 have reported. Anyway, that's what they reported back in April. So if he does stay that long, whether he retires before then is another matter. If he does stay that long, he's going to be the oldest driver in F1 since Graham Hill in 1975 when he was 46. He will be 45 at the end of 2026. I think Fernando is finally reaching the point where his age is starting to creep into his performances, like we had with Raikkonen in 2021. Like, to be fair, Vettel didn't really have. He was up and down, and he had good performances. So I don't think his age really caught up to him just yet because he was only like 35 when he retired.
Yeah, he was 35. His age was not a problem.
And then Lewis has had it in the last few years. I think Fernando, although it's been very delayed, obviously because he's now 43, it's finally caught up to him. I think he's just. It's not like. As I said, with Fernando, you usually get like a bolt out of the blue, like, oh my God, this is really good. Or some moment that makes you think, wow, this guy's really got it still. But we haven't had that this season. It's like last season, Stroll was capitulating and blowing up every other race. And now it's Fernando that's doing that. It's just flipped on its head. I think he's finally got his age caught up with him. And I think he's fine. I think he may retire before the end of his contract.
When he returned in 2021, the only thing he acknowledged in terms of age was that it takes him a bit longer to recover from jet lag. And his performances were still fine. I mean, 21 was a fairly quiet season, but like last year, first half was amazing and he was really invigorated and everything. And then it fell off mid-season and then he just fell back into he sunk back into his McLaren phase of just not caring and becoming very cynical. And you could see it in his driving that he's just not, he's not really putting the effort in anymore. I mean, yeah, scrappy race. And then like last year, for example, he crashed in the sprint in Spa. And before the race even happened, he was like, well, the sprint doesn't matter because he hadn't qualified anywhere near the points anyway. And he's not, I get that he doesn't have a life outside of F1 and doesn't do anything else. I didn't realize, I think he used to be married and now he's divorced or something. But he doesn't have a family like Checo and Vettel and Hülkenberg to think about. So he'll probably just get, because we all know he wants that third title, or at least wants to get another win, but it's clearly not going to happen. So it's like, why bother if you're just going to be driving around a car that's miserable in a team that's miserable with a teammate that's miserable and isn't even a benchmark to compare yourself to? And yeah,
I do think that an interesting proposition would be for him to go to IndyCar and finally try and get that triple crown that he's been craving for a couple of years now. Which he did in his little hiatus from Formula One. I think something we didn't touch on with Daniel Ricciardo was I think that he would be perfect for something like IndyCar because he's affiliated with America with his fan base. He's admittedly, I know you don't get the hype behind him, but to the general public, he's a likable character and he's got a personality that IndyCar is lacking at the moment. And he would be a star signing because, like when Romain Grosjean signed to Dale Coyne in 2021. A lot of F1 fans jumped onto IndyCar and started watching it because of Grosjean. And Grosjean was nowhere near the level of popularity of Ricciardo.
Yeah, I mean, he's someone who, he is actually quite popular in America, as you said. I mean, he goes on the talk shows and he does those Wired tutorial videos about critiquing racing films and stuff like that. Yeah, he could go there and have some fun, maybe. I mean, I can't see someone like Ricciardo doing WEC, really. I can't picture that. But yeah, IndyCar, why not? Alonso, I don't think he would do a full IndyCar campaign. He'd be one of the ones that just does the ovals or just does the 500 to give it a go. I think maybe he did have to take a bit of humble pie when the last time he tried it, because I think he realized, it's not quite as simple as, you can't just jump into this and be. It's a very different style of racing to Formula.
To be fair, I don't know if it was 2019 or 2020 when he didn't qualify, but because I think one year his engine went. And then the next year he didn't qualify because he got knocked out on bump day. That was because I think basically it was McLaren he entered with both years or something like that. And obviously McLaren have a British base and an American base. And apparently they got the conversions wrong with some of their like setup adjustments. And apparently they were running setups with like 2.3 inches that were supposed to be 2.3 centimeters kind of thing. So their setups were completely off. Mm-hmm. And I think Alonso would he would just do the 500 now you say it. And I think Ricciardo, because obviously he's a massive Dale Earnhardt fan, that's why he runs the number 3. He could go to NASCAR, even though he said he doesn't like ovals. He could easily go to NASCAR.
And it would fit his sort of half redneck image.
Yes.
Just something like that for fun. One of these series you can retire in, something that's a bit more, a bit less soul destroying than Formula E. And something with more of a
and more
credibility, I suppose. Even though Ricciardo, by all accounts, would probably be a reasonably good fit.
He could even become a pundit for like Australian TV.
Yeah, if they're, I don't know who does their coverage in Australia. I don't know if they're like I don't know if they're like in America where they just leech off Sky Sports, but if they've got their own pundits, then yeah, make him one of them. I mean, something like that. So Aston Martin things are not going brilliant. Who's left? I think we've only got 2 teams.
Williams, we haven't done them yet.
Williams and Sauber. Okay, let's do Sauber. This should take about 2 minutes. Okay, well, they qualified exactly where you would expect them to. But the pit stops were actually good for once. But even with good pit stops, they still finished 16th and 17th. And Joe got hit by Alonso. That's basically everything that they did.
Yes, they're just such an anonymous team at the moment. There's nothing going for them.
Yeah, they're not. Their performances, they're not doing anything different. They don't even try different strategies. They seem to put more effort into the fan art for every race weekend. They do these really elaborate like anime style posters and to advertise every race.
I haven't seen those. I'm gonna have to have a look. You mentioned
they're all on Twitter. They're quite elaborate. Those on Instagram, they'll do those. But Bottas hasn't even had any big like personality since he did that Uber Eats or whatever it was advert in Australia.
And his mullet and his whole yak sort of thing.
Yeah. So now there is so we know Hulkenberg's going there next year. I keep saying Zane Maloney should do it, but to be honest, he's plummeting in Formula 2, so maybe not. He's not such the prospect that he was. I don't want Bottas to go there because Bottas should have retired years ago. Joe is just there he's got all that communist money. Ocon maybe, I don't know.
You're forgetting Teo Pourchaire.
Oh yeah, Pourchaire. Well, of course he's a free agent now because he got fired after 2 races with McLaren because Nolan Siegel's dad's wallet showed up in the paddock.
Siegel is also a very good driver though, and he's also fit. So
he is a good driver, but I'm told that basically his dad has got like an avalanche of money behind him, and that's how he's doing things. I mean, didn't he win in the LMGTE category in Le Mans?
Yeah, he won LMGT2 in Le Mans.
LMP2, you mean?
Yeah, that's what I meant. That's
LMP2, yeah. But that was just obviously that's not our forte IndyCar, but that was just a very funny situation that Malukas breaks his hand, and then Callum Ilott and Teo Pourchaire both alternate with the seat, and then they just tear up Malukas' contract before he even gets time to come back, and then they give it to Pourchaire, and then he's like, oh my god, I can't wait to race in Le Mans, Laguna Seca, and then he gets fired, and he's like, I'll be back, and now they've got Nolan Siegel in. He's so yeah, he I guess he is an option. I mean, he won last year's F2 championship. Whoever wins the F2 championship this year is probably not going to Formula 1 because that seems to be how that works now. But he'll fall into the trap that Drugovich is in, where the moment goes very fast and people just forget you exist.
Yeah, like a Fabio Lima or a Davide Valsecchi. I mean, one driver I've always, since the start of the season, I've been monitoring one driver in F2's performances, and only recently in the last few rounds, now he's leading the championship, people are starting to talk about Paul Aron. He's a fantastic driver. he's a rookie, and he's doing better than Behrman, better than Antonelli, better than Maloney, better than any of the drivers who were destined for Formula 1. As much as I like Behrman, he's had a crap F2 season so far, and although I want him to go to Haas next season, Paul Aron needs a seat, and I want him to go to maybe even like a team like Williams.
Yeah, okay. We'll get to Formula 2 in a second, but let's talk about Williams actually to finish up the F1 teams. So yeah, well, the big revelation was that Logan beat Albon in sprint qualifying and made it to SQ2. The race, nothing happened with those two, and then in the main race, but then he got beaten again, this time only by about 0.2, so quite narrow, but enough to make it 16th and 19th were where they qualified, I think, for the main race. Logan took damage from someone at the start. I think it was Bottas. He damaged his wing, and so he had to pit as well as Leclerc. But compared to Leclerc, he made absolutely no progress. He lost an entire pit stop to Leclerc in the first phase of the race in terms of distance. And he just ran around in last. He didn't spin. He didn't crash, so that's something. Albon, the car's not good here, and he finished he finished 15th ahead of the Saubers and Alonso. So yeah, not much to say on Williams.
You see, I want Sargent to do well because although he's a bit crap, he's a nice guy. He's timid. He's harmless is what I'm trying to say. But we haven't seen anything from him. Like drivers like Mazepin and even drivers like Mazepin, like we saw Brazil 2021, he had a good performance and outperformed Schumacher, even though now we know Schumacher's about as useful as a wooden spoon in a Formula One car. He showed signs of a progression. With Sargent, it's been like Verstappen versus Perez, even though Sargent has outqualified Perez more than he's outqualified his own teammate, which is hilarious. But over it's like Sargent, just apart from this weekend, he's shown nothing in his entire Formula One career that says that's actually beating his teammate.
Yeah, he hasn't once had a good weekend. He has 1 point which he got by default because of double disqualification. I suppose it's so tempting to say Zandvoort last year because he made Q3, but only because he crashed in Q2, and then he crashed in the race, although the crash wasn't his fault. That was the team squandering things. But yeah, it's this complete absence of good moments. His personality is interesting because, as you said, he's very timid. It's the complete opposite of like Scott Speed and Santino Ferrucci, who are these typically just very boisterous, arrogant Americans, and he's not like that. He's much more timid. You think it'd be kind of fun if he had a personality that was more like Scott Speed's, because he injected some kind of energy and pizzazz into what was a very reserved kind of prim and proper grid of European drivers. And he brings all this American sass and all of that. And Logan doesn't do that. And again, he's not that well known in America because he raced in Europe for his. So
he's also not shit.
Yeah, and so from a marketing perspective, he's not a huge draw. It's just because the thing is, in his feeder series run, he was reasonably good. I mean, he only just lost F3 to Oscar, so he got caught in that crash in the final race. Pretty promising in F2, not the best, but obviously good enough to get in Williams' good books. But now it's just there's a complete absence of it. The latest thing is saying that he might get a seat with Kramer in IndyCar next year when they move up. And I'm like, to be honest, that's great. That's a perfect fit for him. Let's have him go to IndyCar, and he can be very happy there, I'm sure, rather than him just having nowhere to go at all.
Yeah, well, if he does leave Williams, he's not getting another seat on the grid. Let's be honest. Yeah, like as I said, he doesn't have the. I'm not really. I know Scott Speed was quite brash and outspoken during his Formula One career, but I never actually watched him because I mean he was 2006 through to the start of 2007 when he got
06, 07, yeah.
Vettel, so I didn't really. Yeah, I wasn't really watching at the time, so I wouldn't know. Santino Ferrucci, because I watch IndyCar, he's just a massive cunt, really. He just goes around acting like he's the biggest person. I think he went up to was it Scott Dixon or Will Power after one of the previous races because they had a bit of a run-in, and he acted like he was at fault when actually it was Santino who was at fault. It's like you don't go up to a two-time world champion when you've never done anything in your entire career and act like he's some sort of gimp and you're something special when you're not, mate.
Yeah, I mean, his haircut should be criminal as well. I don't know what the fuck is going on there. But when he was a Haas development driver, everyone hated him. I think he was, he got fired for driving around without his gloves on and with a mobile phone in his hand or something. And he was knowing him, he was probably being racist to Arjun Maini. I'm sure I've heard something about that as well. He's classic, just like poor little rich boy kind of thing. Just came from loads of money and has never eaten humble pie in his life. Fortunately, he'll never be in Formula One. In terms of who fills that Williams seat, though, so you mentioned Aaron. He, I think, would be a great fit. I mean, he's in a very difficult bind because he's not in an academy, and getting an F1 seat without being in an academy is really difficult these days.
He was with Mercedes.
Yes, he was with Mercedes and ended up getting let go, and suddenly his performances have always been good, but they've improved even more. That he hasn't won a race yet, but he's had a podium at every F2 weekend, but he hasn't had a double podium at every weekend yet. But consistency is key. He would be a very good fit for Williams. James Vowles is really trying to get Sainz because he's been acknowledging we need 2-star drivers. So he's being more vocal against Logan now. Sainz, I think the latest thing was he was looking at that, but now he's suddenly been given an offer by Alpine, which by all accounts would be a far better choice than
Works
Williams.
even probably more money.
Yeah, and also the car is just faster. I think for him, he's not going to care. Oh, they're squabbling about so and so. It's like I just want a car that's faster because he's not. I don't think he's going to be interested. Oh, let's build this team up from the ground up and start a new project. He's like, give me a car that can win races. That's what I want. I've done the hard graft, and I shouldn't have been fired from Ferrari. So I need to get my redemption in, and he won't get that with Williams. Bottas, if they want an experienced piece of hands that's going to be as boring as you can imagine, then he can go to Williams. In terms of their academy drivers, O'Sullivan is mid at the moment. I mean, he did a podcast recently. It was a really, really good podcast, but he said to himself, he doesn't actually enjoy racing. He enjoys the competitive element, but the actual driving experience. And I think he said he has options if he decides to just quit racing. Colapinto had a good weekend in F2. He's the more senior. He's the most senior of the juniors. It's probably going to create problems similar to the scandal we've seen with Agustin Canapino in F2, putting an Argentine driver in a British team, and we saw that 40 years ago with Carlos Reutemann with Williams as well. He's one that you could see eventually there. Yeah, I don't know who else might have a crack, but they've got quite a few options. Do Williams?
Yeah, they've got their fingers in a lot of pies. You've got, as I said, you've got Sainz, you've got potentially Ricciardo, potentially Bottas, potentially Lawson. If he doesn't get an RB, I think he's well within his rights to say, oh well, fuck you, I'm going to another team like a Piastri. Aaron, you've got loads of. They have lots of choices. I don't think, as much as I want them to go for someone like Aaron or Colapinto and promote someone from a junior ranks, I don't think they will, because they did that with Sargent. Admittedly, it was a year early, but they did that with Sargent, and look where it got them.
But the thing is, you have to eventually. We can't keep saying, "Oh, this classic thing of it's an entry level position, but you need 10 years of experience." Like we have to get some rookies in eventually. And the other elephant in the room that I forgot is Kimi Antonelli, because people are saying if he doesn't go straight up to Mercedes, he might just stay. He might just spend some time at Williams. People keep thinking he'll go up this year. They're not going to put him up this year, because he'll spend as long as it'll take him all season to get up to pace with where Sargent has been. And if we do segue into Formula 2 now, it's not working. Like his performances, it really is not there. It's getting worse and worse. I mean, he finished outside the points in both races this weekend. He still doesn't have a podium, whereas the other Frecker graduate, Joshua Dirksen, has a podium. Would have won that sprint, the feature race last week, if the engine hadn't blown up in Spain. And then he had a net pole position because of Dennis Hauger's getting mecha-chromed, and that. So it's the honeymoon phase is beginning to wear off, and maybe we're falling into a sort of Emma Raducanu situation where the media just like jump on him like flies on a turd or something, and just swarm him, and it's like, oh, he's amazing, he's the next one, and then he just cracks, and we just ruin a good time.
I mean, I will partially defend Antonelli, because up until Behrman won the sprint race, Prema was the only team in the entire F2 grid to not have a podium. They have been apocalyptically shit by their standards this year. They're like sixth in the championship, I think, still. And I think Antonelli and Behrman are both really good drivers. It's not but I've been arguing with my friends about this because I'm a massive Behrman supporter. You don't go from winning 4 races and getting a clean sweep last year in Baku to shit. You don't do that. It's not how junior series racing works. And Antonelli has jumped up 2 steps. I know Dirksen's done the same and has adapted better. But Antonelli's 17. Give him a break. I think they have promoted him too quickly. I would have done F3, F2, even though like they said, oh, it's a new formula for F2 cars, so it'll be easier to adapt. It won't be easier to adapt. He's going to a car with about 3 times the horsepower and about twice the grip.
And drivers which are far better as well, because everyone was raving about. They were looking at Zandvoort last year, like, oh my god, it's like Donington '93 or whatever, and it's like it's Frecker. Half of it is amateur drivers. A lot of them are in maybe their first or second season of single seaters. Half the grid doesn't even have a Wikipedia on. Like it's not much of it unless you're driving. The only drivers that you should really be looking at are the ones driving for Prema, because the others just don't mean anything. Even Formula 3, half the grid are useless. Formula 2 has they've lucked into what has been there aren't really any obvious howlers. Like it's a very, very strong grid.
Yes.
In general. I mean, Villa Gomez is definitely worse than the rest of them. Stanek has not been brilliant, even though he won but it's overall it's quite strong. I'm becoming increasingly disillusioned with Formula 2 because it's looking so unattractive to teams, and I think also just to prospective drivers. Because in the race yesterday, we saw 3 drivers stalled at the start. I mean, these cars they don't have anti-stall, and the engines break a lot, and it's like they're paying £2 million a year to race in this series, and they're getting their chances at Formula One jeopardized by the cars not working properly, and stuff like that. And these are already cars which look like absolute arse to drive, and it's really not making it a particularly attractive. Particularly when if you win it, there's no guarantee you'll get a Formula One seat because you'll have to wait a year, and even then, by then the moment might be gone because someone else has won it and could that spot. And you're going to end up either doing Formula E or IndyCar. They need to fix things because the pipeline to Formula One is just not working. Because we could have a position next year where we have there are 5 legitimate rookies we could have on the grid next year if you count Lawson as a rookie. But we could also just as easily have none of them on the grid.
I do think, I think the main problem is there aren't enough teams. Like what a driver academy could do in like 2010 through to about 2016 was put a driver like Esteban Ocon or Daniel Ricciardo or any of their young drivers, or Jules Bianchi, for example, in a Marussia or a HRT or a Caterham for a season or two. Watch them. They'll outperform their teammate most likely, but they won't kick up any fuss because they're in a Marussia or a Caterham. And then they'll do. We need another. Even if they're going to be a bit shit, which I don't think Andretti would be. Andretti would be at least competitive and not at the back of a grid by 55 seconds. Bring Andretti in. They should have let, I think, either High Tech or Carlin were the other two of the other prospective teams, weren't they? But were actually sensible and not like stupid fucking lucky strike or whatever it was called. You get what I mean? Or some of the other, just the retarded teams that are just like the prospective ones that are never ever going to make it to Epsilon Stadium and stuff like that.
The 12, the 11 teams that never got selected back in 2010.
Yeah.
Extra 3 teams is kind of important because even if it's in a position where it's like in 2010 where you could have each team has, well, I mean, Lotus had 2 experienced ones, 1 experienced driver and 1 rookie. That's at least he's there. You know, put Bottas in one of these useless new teams, and then put like Antonelli or someone else in there, and it's like you've got something to bounce off there. Put not Ricardo, but Magnussen. I don't know, someone like that.
Yeah.
Put one of those.
A yardstick.
Yeah, just a yardstick because 2 rookies. I mean, Haas are never going to do that because I think Schumacher and their problem is that it looks like they're taking Behrman, but I think Schumacher and Mazepin seem to have put them off ever wanting rookies again. But yeah, it's just not big enough, and it's because we've had grids of this size in the past, but the driver turnaround was really high. That was the difference. Yes. And now people, well, first of all, you're expected to do a whole season, but also they get locked in for multiple seasons as well. It just needs to change because it's not. It's like I can enjoy F2 and I can say, oh, so and so is driving brilliantly, but then I get anxious when they do start driving brilliantly because it's like, well, now you're in a bind because if you win the title, you can't race in Formula 2 again, but you're probably not going to Formula 1. So now what? Like, there are some series, it's like maybe it's worth, sabotaging the final race to stop yourself winning the champ, because then you can fall back on doing another season of F2 if you have to.
Do a Charles Peak with Marussia in 2012 at Brazil.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I think Vesti, he decided to leave. I think the money had run out, but now he's become just completely... What's he doing now? He's become completely invisible.
I don't know. Well, most likely GT racing, I assume, because that's where all they go.
Yeah, he's probably doing Elms or something. Is he still a Mercedes Junior as well?
No, I don't think I think they ditched all of their junior drivers to focus on Antonelli, which is stupid.
I think it's just. I need to look this up. I'm sure there are other ones. They'll have sponsored. They'll have.
They'll be lower down.
They'll be lower down. Yeah. They'll have girls in F1 Academy, but they're not.
Orion Pan, I think, is one of them.
They're not official juniors. I would say. Mercedes. Okay, let's see. Oh no, they've got quite a few. Oh, they're much lower. Yeah. Antonelli, Alex Powell, Yuan Pu Kui, never heard of him. Fred Vesti is still, he's in Elms, he's still a junior. Luna Fluxer in karting, Kenzo Craigie in karting, and then Dorian Pan. So they've got a couple, but yeah, Kimi is the one they're putting all their eggs in hit, but it may not even work out fully. There are several drivers you could make a case for to get to Formula One, because now, Aaron is driving amazing. Hadjar, lots of bad luck. He's quite annoying, but he seems to be the best Red Bull junior at the moment, other than Lawson. Bortoletto, he's a McLaren junior. That's a complete dead end, but he's picking himself up. I mean, he sort of fell upwards in Formula 3 last year and won it by being the least worst driver instead of the best one. But now he's getting into a mojo in Formula 2 and doing all right. Maloney's dropping off. Colapinto's nowhere. Jack Crawford is suddenly improving, but again, he's an Aston Martin junior, so that's a complete dead end. Hauger, bad luck, but now he's left Red Bull, and it's like maybe just let it go. And the rest are just, yeah.
There just needs to be some better provisions in place for these drivers, like the sprints idea that we came up with earlier, with the reserve drivers. I mean, I think you said in your manifesto video that you'd make like an FIA team, or you'd force at least one rookie, you'd force the F2 champion to be on the grid. I don't think that'd work because you wouldn't be able to enforce it. You'd have to jeopardize an entire team potentially if just giving them a driver they don't want.
Well, no, it would be. Well, the whole point is that I wouldn't do that with one of the current teams. It would be a new team it would be a newly built team which is controlled by the FIA itself.
Yeah.
And it would be a team where they have a team principal and they have that same structure, but it's designed with the purpose of being that bridge between the two. Yes. I think the rules I set out was that they can only. I think you're allowed a maximum of 2 seasons with the team, and every year they are obliged to take the incumbent Formula 2 champion on at the start of each season, picking out someone else. But it means you're guaranteed to at least have a full season in Formula 1. And it's something. Another option, because we mentioned about the sprint race thing, is maybe they should just bring back Friday drivers, because we've had races where Behrman takes over in FP1. Maybe their reserve driver, like Jack Dew and the others, they should have a third chassis which runs in FP1 and FP2 every weekend, because that would create the problem of lack of testing. Because now, long gone are the days of unlimited testing mileage. It's mostly simulator work and the occasional private test in obsolete cars. Why not have Friday drivers?
The only problem with that is cost cap.
Well, then they should raise it. I don't know.
Just fuck it. Just bend it to your will.
The money is getting out of hand. Teams used to be able to function on 20 or 30 million pounds a year, and now the FIA is talking about, let's raise the entry fee to £1 billion when it used to be like 10 million or something.
I think in 1989 when we had that crazy 39 car season, I think it was actually about 50 grand, 500 grand, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't need to be that extreme, but we do need to make it a bit more accessible.
Yeah.
It's just getting so stupidly expensive. I mean, the team budgets have skyrocketed. I mean, in 2010, around like in the V8 era, a high budget would have been 200 to 250 mil. I think that's what Red Bull had. I think Toyota's was close to 400 mil. I think Haas alone is double that now. It's insane how big it is. I don't think that salaries. I don't think they're regulated by the cost cap. But when they're looking at 100 million a year for Hamilton at Ferrari, that's 2.5 HRTs. Yeah, it's just a bit much.
Only the top 3 employees of each team don't count towards the cost cap. So salaries are included in the cost cap.
Right. Okay. And it's like, well, people complain, the car's shit. It's like, well, then pay your drivers less. They're not going to end up on the street if you pay them less than £50 million a year. It's not to sound like a socialist, but they could afford to cap their. They could afford to live on a few million less a year.
Yeah. I do think salaries are more about prestige than the money itself.
Oh yeah, no, it's never about the money, because it's not about paying the bills. It's about image and about reputation. That's how it is at that level. It's it goes beyond the monetary value side of it. Another option, of course, is that if a team signs the incumbent F2 champion, they get a cash bonus of $5 million or something. And it's like maybe that could be an incentive similar to. I was trying to think. I was trying to think of. There was a political example where you get sort of a bonus for doing something like. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. It's something like that. It's just if you sign them up, here's an extra £5 million.
Also, something I thought of, because I remember you talked about potentially, because of it's a team run by the FIA, potential bias, obviously, with regulations and stuff. Something I've just thought of, just make it so they aren't eligible for championship points. There can't be any bias.
No, I wouldn't do that, because that's similar to when you have guest drivers in the lower formulas and they're not allowed to accept points. And it still needs to be a point in its own right. They would need to sort out putting in some kind of regulatory standards that means that they're not getting, cash handed under the table, or they haven't got a mole that's saying, they're introducing these are the technical reg next year. I think it would need to have I'm trying to remember the full details. I think I put something in about a capped budget for the team, so that they can't just throw in $1 billion and make it the best team ever. But it still needs to be. They still need to be there fair and square, but on the smaller side of it. But just to bridge the gap.
12 teams.
If they're not going to accept any other teams.
Yeah, 12 teams I think is a minimum because, like, for example, 2012 was one of the best seasons in F1 history and that had 24 cars on the grid. 20, as you said, 13 teams is what you'd like. I think that would be pushing because obviously I think that is a maximum. You can only have 26 cars on the grid, and then we get into pre-qualifying and shit like that, which I don't think.
Monaco would be interesting. They would have to completely redesign the quality format for Monaco 26.
Just do what F2 do with or F2 and F3 do with the split qualifying.
Yeah, I mean the split qualifying it works, but at the same time you can always have accusations about things like track conditions changing between the two sessions. It tends to benefit one half over the other, but that can't be held. This is the only other than massively extending the length of qualifying, maybe doubling it to 2 hours, so everyone gets time to get runs in properly.
They probably all still go at the same time because of track conditions.
Yeah, they're going to be stupid and do it that way. They're always going to do the dumb thing. I mean, didn't that happen? Sprint quali, of course, that happened with Leclerc, that he missed the cut because they all decided to go out at the last minute. And it's like, for once, wouldn't it be better to set a lap time where you don't have a perfect toe and the lap times and the track is not at the perfectly rubber dim and temperature? Isn't that better than not setting a lap time at all?
Yeah, I was watching Sky F1's coverage. Did you see? Was it Gasly, Ocon, and Perez were literally like 2 seconds away from each other? It was beyond retarded.
We had, because they put these rules in Italy because 2019 was a huge farce, and before people even they were coming up to the line. It's like, do you not see what's about to happen here? It's like, just ignore the toe and just go. Like Hulkenberg went and did a lap, but the rest of them were messing around. It's like, you have to start thinking a bit more about strategy. It annoys me a bit because I wish that the slower teams that make Q3 would go a bit faster, because they often, Alpine and Haas and that, they will often set lap times slower than Q1. Because I guess their logic is, we've just made it to Q3 and that's enough for us, so we're not fighting for pole. But it's like, I wouldn't mind them pushing them to see how close they can actually get to the front runner. But they strategy is just, yeah.
I think what could make everyone more interesting, this is another thing, one shot or aggregate qualifying coming back.
Not aggregate, but the one shot, there is definitely some merit to that. Again, you fall into the trap of things like France 2003, where if the weather changes, you have that problem. And I think Schumacher used to try and, in the aggregate, he used to find ways of manufacturing pole positions for himself based on when he went out. I think that this format for qualifying, it's fine. It's just that they need to the strategist needs to pull their head out of their arse a bit. In terms of creating traffic light.
I mean, I think it would be a good idea to do one-shot qualifying, but in reverse championship order. So the lowest driver in championship goes out last, so he has the best chance of getting. I mean, I think
that's what they used to do. Yeah,
you mentioned wet weather. I think what we should do is do that, but then if it's wet weather, just go back to a normal qualifying system, so there's no problems.
Yeah, that could be it. That could think about. Yeah,
or just say a 10-minute session, 10-minute session, and everyone's got to get a lap in.
That would be nuts. But yeah, the one lap, there is definitely a people would complain that it has merit, but people would find loopholes and funny things like that to.
Because people would say we want entertainment, and then when the entertainment means that their driver gets 18th, they cry about it.
Yeah. Goodness, I think we covered most things in there. Yeah, well, good weekend overall, good race overall, lots of the drama. I mean, 2023 started really badly, and I was thinking this is really not working. But now everyone's reinvigorated again. It's turning into rather a good season.
Yeah, I think the regulation changes that came in 2022, people are now starting to finally get the hang of them, and it's typical. A few seasons into a regulation change, it's producing good racing because the racing is a lot closer than it was 2 seasons ago.
Just in time for when the new regulations come in. This is something I wanted to talk about, actually, is that we're now at the point when regulations used to be introduced as a response to teams making something that they felt was too fast or too dangerous or too competitive. Whereas we're in the last few, it's where the FIA dictates how the cars are going to look, rather than, here's some small regulation changes, let's see what the teams come up with. We get this like template of how the cars are going to look, and that perfectly demonstrates how restrictive and how controlled the regulations are. That and why the cars are so similar now is because it used to happen organically and just small subtle changes rather than this is how everyone's car is supposed to look.
I do think it's particularly crap because we've got new regulations coming in 2026 and then more regulation changes coming in 2030. That's 3 regulation changes in 8 seasons or 8 years. Like if you look at, for example, the 1950s through to the 1970s, the only real big changes we had in terms of actual regulations were the change from the Formula 2 regs from 1952 to 1953 and when they changed from 1.5 litres to 3.5 litres in 1965. Like, that's it.
They went back and forth with engine size, and there was like a minimum weight limit. But other than that, everything else they didn't. There was hardly anything that changed in terms of in terms of chassis design. Basically, nothing was enforced.
That's why you had plywood chassis and shit like that.
Yeah, but also there wasn't. Oh, the front wing needs to be this wide, and the leading edge needs to be this high up, and it's just it's too much. Like, yeah. I mean, the 26 cars, they look good. I mean, they look more like the mid 2000s ones. How they're going? I mean, I know the teams are concerned about these regulations because they're introducing active aero and they're concerned on safety grounds about that. But it's hard. I don't know. I mean, these cars, the 22 cars were a novelty in how they looked kind of futuristic, but now, I'll be honest, they don't look like Formula One cars to me. I don't know what the fuck's going on with the front and rear wings, but these just aren't Formula One cars. Whereas the 26 ones, those look like Formula One.
Yeah, they look smaller. They look more refined. Like it looks like they've put too many curves on the modern cars, I think, and now it's a bit more down the straight and narrow. It does look a bit like a mix between the 2008 and 2009 regulations.
Yeah, and it's really balanced well. But we'll see what that does. But I fear we'll just be in the trap of one team cracks the code and then they just dominate for another 5 years. It seems to be the position we're in.
Because of cost cap as well.
Yes, yeah. It seems, at least for the remainder of this season, Red Bull's their outright dominance has come to an end, but they're still such a well-oiled machine in terms of the team running and one of their drivers that they can continue to win. Yeah, Silverstone in a few days, and I guess we'll just see. Hope it usually delivers. I'm sure it will this time, but
I wanted to piss it down. That would create an interesting race.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at the forecast. It's been pretty dry, warm and dry here. So it's unlikely there'll be rain, but that always throws. Yeah, we've got that to look forward to. But yeah, that's all for this. That's the outro for my own videos. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.